Collected Fruits of Occult Teaching. By A. P. Sиннет. Preface. Theosophical literature, from the outset of the great movement it inaugurated, has been largely concerned with previously unknown laws governing the origin and destinies of humanity, the birth and progress of worlds. The coherent design of the solar system and, in short, with the interpretation, in the light of knowledge till recently reserved for a very few, of the stupendous divine purpose underlying physical manifestation. My own earlier books, The Occult World and Esoteric Buddhism, forecast rather than embodied teaching along such lines, revealing the existence of those whom I called the elder brethren of humanity, who had risen above the level of generally current civilization, and thus had touch with the wisdom of the divine hierarchy. An experiment was in progress to ascertain if ordinary culture had attained a stage at which it would appreciate a flood of new thought relating to a science loftier than any dealing exclusively with phenomena perceptible to the physical senses. And in connection with that experiment I was privileged to receive a considerable volume of information relating to the early history of mankind millions of years antedating the range of historical record. Also to the concatenation of worlds and the ultimate destinies of our own. Though crude and incomplete, this preliminary sketch of occult science and of the agency through which, though unknown to the multitude, the purpose of creation was being worked out on the physical plane, thrilled the readers of the message all over the civilized world to an extent which gave rise to an organization, the Theosophical Society, which now covers Great Britain, Europe generally, and the United States of America with innumerable branches. Fresh teaching and information relating to the great subjects enumerated above has meanwhile been flowing into my hands, and much has been embodied in my book, The Growth of the Soul. Also, since the publication of that book, in a large number of articles in reviews, pamphlets, and transactions, of the London Lodge of the Theosophical Society over which I preside. The present volume collects these scattered contributions to our superphysical knowledge, still growing and expanding in its scope and value. At some later date the fundamental principles laid down in the earlier books, the illuminating interpretation of these in the essays now reproduced and further light on mysteries previously obscure, may constitute something resembling a complete spiritual science. But students need not wait for this result before assimilating the knowledge already acquired. During this life we are each of us imprisoned in the five senses, and, though thought reaches out far beyond them, its range is limited by the capacity of the physical brain. In time that capacity will expand. Ideas easily grasped by the man of modern culture are beyond the comprehension of the savage. The improved intellectual mechanism of future generations will no doubt deal freely with conceptions which present culture cannot appreciate. Spiritual science, however, is an infinitude, and no attempt to interpret it in physical plain language will ever be more than suggestive and alluring. But it is equally true that human faculty on this plane of life will develop as time goes on under the influence of effort to expand its range. Unconsciously in most cases students of the spiritual science within our reach will do more than profit by understanding it so far. They will have established a claim on nature for improved vehicles of consciousness in later lives, and will have contributed to raise the level of human understanding. I am sure the experience of many theosophists will show that within the limits of the current life ideas can now be easily handled in thought, which could not have been held in the mind during earlier periods of study. These may still defeat the resources of physical plain speech, but they forecast intellectual conditions that will ultimately outrun those resources. That state of things should be a stimulus to theosophical study in whatever direction it may tend, and few of the essays in this volume will be found destitute of hints that will attract thought into some new channel of spiritual, or, at least, of superphysical enlightenment. In no direction, as we press forward exploring the mysteries of nature, may we expect to attain finality. Broad principles may be firmly established and at first they seem to be clearly outlined. Search for detail soon renders the outline shadowy without suggesting any distrust of the broad principle. For example, the most fundamental teaching of theosophy in relation to current human life shows us reincarnation as essential to the spiritual growth of each ego. In one of the essays in this book on theosophical teachings liable to be misunderstood, So much detail is added to the original teaching on this subject that when we absorb this, the broad idea without that detail seems as likely to mislead as to instruct. Earlier statements concerning the mechanism of the solar system, the planetary chains, the successive manvantaras, etc., were vividly significant at first. They remain as revelations of natural truth that we can never lose touch with, but surrounded by the later interpretation dealt with in some of the present essays. Concerning the way in which the planetary chains are concatenated together and the way in which the manvantaras expand and contract. The first sketches of the truth are seen to fail altogether in showing it illustrative of the beautiful symmetry and purpose of the divine design. Some readers of the earlier books are too easily satisfied. The genuine occult student will never stand still. Henry V, preparing for battle at Agincourt, declared that, if it be a sin to covet honor, I am the most offending soul alive. And the occult student may think of knowledge, the true knowledge, the comprehension and appreciation of divine manifestation in the same heroic spirit. How do you find this book? Any thoughts about the book or the author? Any suggestion for improvement? Please take a moment to share your thoughts in a comment. If you like it, share it with your friends who might enjoy it as well. Subscribe to keep in touch. Visit CompleteAudiobooks.com for more quality content. This world's place in the universe. Religious emotion was, till recently, at war with science, especially indignant with astronomy for disturbing primitive conceptions as to the way this world was first opened for business. But a bold application of the principle that biblical language need not be taken at the foot of the letter gradually enlarged its interior meaning until the rotundity and annual revolution of the earth were fitted into the story told in Genesis. Evolution as accounting for the human form then came within sight of a gloomy toleration if modernists insisted on it. That, however, which religious emotion has not yet quite realized is the sublime truth that, the more we are enabled to penetrate the deep mysteries of nature, the more profoundly reverent we become in contemplating the impenetrable infinitudes of that divine power which operates alike in guiding the growth of protoplasm and the majestic mechanism of the solar system. Critics who preferred when Darwin first shattered the paraphernalia of medieval theology, like a bull in a china shop, to remain on the side of the angels, made the immense mistake of supposing that the angels, regarded as agents of divinity, would be disestablished if we began to approach an understanding of the way they did their work. A view growing familiar with some students of nature involves the idea that even natural forces are the expression of conscious will on some exalted levels of spiritual potency. That the so-called laws of nature are definite divine enactments, not merely blind attributes of matter. And we can hardly begin to form a rational conception of the world's development under divine control without including this idea in our thinking. The reconciliation of religion and science has been advancing by leaps and bounds of late, and 7 men of science, all of the foremost rank, recently published a collection of addresses frankly declaring their belief in God as a fundamental idea underlying scientific study. The record of the old conflict is now ancient history. But this result is not a conclusion. It is only a beginning. The 7 scientific leaders, quite in agreement as regards the main proposition, may be groping in various directions in the search for a definite mental picture of the God in whom they believe. Perhaps all would admit that the reality does not lend itself to the formation of a mental picture. Religion reconstructed on scientific principles must build up a conception of divinity by working from below upward. The earlier fashion attempted to work from above downward. In the beginning, certain things happened, we were told by teachers who, quite reasonably in dealing with young people, ignored the idea that eternity has no beginning. But now that embryology must be recognized as a method of creation, when we talk about the human form we feel the need of an embryology as applied to planetary creation. And so we come to recognize the subtle, mysterious laws of organic growth not as displacing the divine creative will, but as the agency by which it is fulfilled in physical manifestation. So by degrees, with help available at the present day, for those especially who realize that human consciousness can be reached by other channels of perception besides the 5 senses, We reach the idea that divine agency is worked out through an enormously elaborate and magnificent hierarchy of spiritual beings, beyond whom, in dazzling and, as yet, impenetrable mystery, there exists an incomprehensibly sublime power, of whom the sun may be thought of as the physical symbol. In the mental search for God we may pause at this stage of the effort. Human intelligence is more limited in its scope than early philosophers imagined, but is quite limitless as regards its expectations. It presumes to talk about the divine power which accounts for the whole universe. Distant stars, though to be counted by millions and mostly gigantic compared with the star, or sun, to which we belong, must come into the same creative scheme as the sparrows in Kensington Gardens. The Sunday school teacher can be content with nothing less than a God who is responsible for the Milky Way as well as for the milky mothers of the field. And medieval painters have even presented us with his portrait. In some foreign gallery I have seen him included in a family group. The father with a long beard is in an armchair with the third person of the Trinity as a pigeon perched on the back, and the son in a chair of somewhat lesser dignity beside him. Enlightened members of the English Church would generally be shocked at this grossly materialistic presentation of the divine mystery. Forgetful of their own declaration of belief that Christ ascended into heaven and sitteth on the right hand of God, the Father Almighty. From the Fudge family in Paris we learn that a certain forcible expression, impossible in English, doesn't sound half so shocking in French. And on the same principle an idea merely formulated in words that no one stops to invest with a meaning is not half so shocking as the same idea depicted on canvas by means of oil color. In the days of the old conflict, those who dealt with it, Draper and others, dwelt especially on the savage ferocity with which the early church endeavored to stifle astronomical discovery. Faith, at that time, might have been correctly described as the faculty that enables us to believe what we know to be untrue. It was endangered by the astronomical emphasis of the untruthfulness in question, but in the long run, as astronomy held the field, faith fell into line with discovery, and in spite of ecclesiastical opposition became ennobled in character. The god of a Semitic tribe might with an effort of imagination be fitted into an armchair. The god of a solar system, including a central sun many thousand times bigger than the Earth and the orbit of Neptune thousands of million miles in diameter, was in a different order of magnitude. And if we attempt to strain imagination by looking upward in thought at that inconceivable splendor, we may realize the futility of the effort by attempting to gaze directly with open eyes on a fine day at the physical sun. Human sight will not tolerate the unveiled light. Human understanding will not bring the God idea, once cleared of blundering theology, to a definite focus. But astronomical discovery does not come to a standstill even after measuring the orbit of Neptune and accounting for the canals of Mars, nor after attempting, however unsuccessfully, to set time limits to the radiant energy of the sun. We are all agreed, though astronomy affords scope for disagreement in some directions, that the whole solar system, the sun attended by his family of planets, is moving through space at about the rate of 12 to 14 miles per second. Whither is it bound? Greenwich authorities would hardly yet venture on a definite reply, but we may if we like indulge in connection with that question. In the fascinating pursuit known to science as extrapolation, the application to regions of thought outside the range of definite observation, of the assumption that laws operative within that range hold good to infinitudes beyond. Almost all the heavenly bodies, quite all if we merely accept meteorites and some comets, move in elliptical orbits more or less closely approximating to the circular form. Plainly, it is much more probable that the sun's motion is in conformity with this general principle, than that it is a blind rush in a straight course, which would infallibly in the long run give rise to a cosmic catastrophe. If the uniformities of nature are maintained, the sun must be revolving in an orbit around some definite sidereal center. Obviously such an orbit must be so vast that any measurable arc will appear to be a straight line. Now I must venture to outrun even extrapolation in the explanation I have to give. I have been permitted in the pages of the 19th century to maintain the position that, in the course of the present Armageddon, unseen powers embodying loftier knowledge than common humanity has yet reached are taking part in the struggle. Some of us in conscious touch with them are sometimes with their help enabled to anticipate scientific discovery. In that way I was concerned, some dozen years before the discovery of radium, with anticipations relating to the constitution of matter, ultimately verified by that discovery in subsequent work based upon it. Happily those anticipations were published at the time, so their character as a successful forecast is not open to dispute. In another direction certain future conclusions in connection with astronomy may be anticipated in their turn. The center around which the solar system is gravitating will be found to be the star Sirius. Common knowledge gives us an approximate measure of some stellar distances. The figure accepted by astronomers for the moment as the distance of Sirius, taking light years as the unit, is 8.8, or call it 8 3/4. A light year is the distance light crosses in a year, moving at the rate of 186,000 miles per second. So it would be inconvenient to give stellar distances in miles. Moreover, there is a wide margin for possible errors in calculations concerned with the parallax of stars. Perhaps it will be found that Sirius is a bit farther off than the currently accepted calculation assumes, but anyhow the real distance is in the same order of magnitude. Estimates of the size and luminosity of Sirius vary very widely, from 300 to 1,000 times the size and brightness of our Sun, but either guess fits in with the main idea to be grasped. Obviously our Sun cannot be the only one that revolves around Sirius. Directly that idea is appreciated, we realize that Sirius must be the central sun of a vast system, in which such suns as ours must be, to Sirius, what the planets are to our Sun. That this is so, can only be ascertained definitely by those in touch with sources of information not yet within general reach, but at all events, meanwhile, as a hypothesis, the statement is clearly in harmony with the uniformities of nature. To regard our solar system and all the others presumably represented by the millions of stars in the sky, as scattered at random about space would be insulting to supreme wisdom and omnipotence. The conception could only be acceptable to thinkers at the kindergarten stage. Certainly up to the middle of the last century grown and grave men did discuss the question whether this was the only inhabited world in the universe. But increasing intelligence has rendered us at once wiser and more modest than when a doubt on that subject was possible. I need not go over the evidence that makes an important group of astronomers certain that Mars, to confine our attention for a moment to our own solar system, is the abode of life not entirely unlike our own. The other planets may not have climatic conditions like our own, but the resources of nature may easily provide vehicles of life appropriate to any conditions of temperature. While those of us who know something more about life, consciousness and spiritual growth than mere surgery would suggest, regard with disdain the idea that any worlds, whether around our Sun or in the infinitudes of space, can be mere inanimate masses of matter destitute of the loftier purposes that life implies. Just for the present all information relating to the Sirian cosmos must remain hypothetical until the astronomy of the future overtakes the forecast. But its value as illuminating reverent imagination reaching in the direction of divinity is very great. It helps us to realize that in all such upward reaching we must blend with the idea of which we are in search, the idea of infinity. In the search within the limits of our own solar system we are hopelessly dazzled long before we touch those limits. But the conception of the Sirian cosmos shows us that incomprehensible as the solar divinity may be, that our miserable word, heat, is degrading in such use, can only be in some dependent relationship to the divinity guiding the whole Sirian cosmos. In other words that God is an infinite hierarchy. Faintly we realize that God, when we think of the Sirian cosmos, is, in some wholly incomprehensible way, greater even, in a stupendous degree, than God, when we think of the solar system and of the various worlds within it of which ours is one. And, indeed, human intelligence, limited in its grasp of detail, unlimited when reaching out towards infinitude, perceives, the moment this last idea is touched, that the Sirian cosmos itself must be in relationship with some still more expanded and sublime organism. That Sirius cannot be a stationary body but must itself, attended by all its family of solar systems, be dependent on some other center of energy, on some other superior manifestation of the infinite God. It is futile even to speculate as to where or what that center may be, but the feeling that it must exist vaguely hints at a unity pervading the whole visible universe. Along that line of thought, however, lies a mental bewilderment that bars further progress. We can play in imagination still with astronomical figures. The bright star Arcturus is said to be 140 light-years distant from us, and yet it shines nearly as brilliantly as Sirius. What must be its actual magnitude and luster? What must be its place in the universal scheme? And some other stars of almost equivalent brilliancy are beyond parallactic measurement altogether. But the purpose which all fulfill must be within the grasp of infinite divinity. Science, growing more and more intimately welded with spiritual aspiration as human intelligence expands, grants us some mental illumination as we seek to penetrate, so far as that may be possible, the mysteries of the divine hierarchy. Certainly, if we turn our attention from the appalling magnitudes of astronomy to the phenomena of the infinitely little, the measurements we have to deal with are equally bewildering. Physicists tell us that a cubic centimeter of water contains 30 trillions of molecules. That if a glass globe 4 inches in diameter were absolutely empty and air molecules admitted at the rate of 100 millions a second 50,000 years would elapse before the globe was full. Such figures are more amusing than instructive, but they may help us, to some extent, in our attempt to formulate a conception of the divine hierarchy. The attributes of the physical molecules, the laws they obey, are obviously as much an expression of divine will as the forces that regulate the march of solar systems in the Sirian cosmos. Within our solar system the divine hierarchy extends downward, as definitely as, beyond it, it extends upward. And though, as we attempt to understand it in its lower levels, we shall soon find mental difficulties almost as insuperable as those attending efforts in the other direction, we can, with help from certain sources of information, arrive at some intelligible conclusions. Astronomy may still help us to some extent. The conditions that must attend life in the various planets of our system must obviously differ very widely. Temperature may vary from below that of ice to above that of steam. Vehicles of consciousness, bodies of whatever matter may be suitable, must vary accordingly. We may safely assume that while some of the fundamental laws of nature may hold good throughout the system, others, for example all appertaining to organic growth, may need local modification. Each world must be controlled, even as regards its physical manifestation, by appropriate divine agency. And very little progress beyond primitive theology makes us sure that, first of all as regards our own world, there are teeming regions of life that lie beyond the cognition of the physical senses. Talk therefore of our familiar planets should properly relate to planetary schemes, embracing much more than the visible globes. So we reach the conception that for each planetary scheme the divine will of the whole solar system must transmit itself through an agency that is still so divine in its character as to dazzle our mental sight. Nonetheless, a very important stage in our study of the divine hierarchy is reached when we realize the principle of agency as working through it. The mind leaps to the conclusion that this principle must be operative right down to the subtle activities of nature that we are in the habit of summing up in the word evolution. For the verification of this conjecture we must obviously be dependent on information received from those sources of superphysical knowledge above referred to. Such information in turn being only subject to the check imposed by our own critical faculties. Does it appeal to our intelligence as essentially reasonable in its character? Leaving that question to be determined later, I will first endeavor to describe the agency through which the purpose of the divine power presiding over the planetary scheme to which this world belongs appears to be worked out in physical manifestation. We have to think of the unseen realms of nature as inhabited by hosts of spiritual beings concerned with the direction of the forces, emanating from superdivine will, which not merely guide organic growth but provide for the growth of the spiritual essence with which such growth is associated. Language is apt to break down in one's hands as a means of conveying ideas that are inextricably blended with still more subtle underlying ideas. We are living in a world the whole raison d'etre of which resides in the opportunity it affords for the growth and expansion of spiritual consciousness. The experiences of consciousness in association with physical environment are the conditions providing for its growth. We may plunge down in search of the beginnings of such growth to levels of consciousness far below those of humanity. But leaving that vast area of thought untrodden, the growth of spiritual consciousness as focused in humanity is itself under the guidance of divine agency whose perfect uniformity of intention, fulfilling the divine purpose, would, if we could see only a little more clearly, present to imagination a system of natural law on the moral plane as unalterable as the natural laws relating to physical matter that we deal with in the chemist's laboratory. Those natural laws of the moral plane are entangled with variable influences arising from human free will, but that only renders the task of the divine agents who guide them more delicate, not less specific. The first glimpses we get in this way, of the intricacy of the work carried out by the hosts of divine agents engaged in guiding the world's growth, prepare us to find that a distribution of function is carried out in that wonderful realm of activity, so that while one great host is concerned with the growth of consciousness, another is concentrated on the task of guiding the growth of form, of carrying out the idea that, for want of a better comprehension of the process, we call the principle of evolution. And such agency works again in its contact with matter through lower agency right down to the manipulation of the molecule. The divine hierarchy is infinite both ways. Inconceivably exalted and inconceivably minute, but in the direction of minutize still conscious and purposeful. Intelligence, with a certain range of freedom within limits, guides not only the gradual improvement of the human form, pari passu with the progress of spiritual growth, but the humbler development of form in the animal kingdom and even variation in the coloring of plants and flowers. The agency concerned with such work cannot be discerned by the physical senses, but finer senses can already sometimes cognize its operation. Though most of us are still too young in evolution to have come into full possession of all the faculties latent in human nature. We are ancients of the earth and in the morning of the times. So brief a sketch as this must be content in some directions with mere faint hints. How do the divine agents concerned, as declared above, with the evolution of form translate their superphysical powers to the physical plane? The answer has to do with what may be called the semi-intelligent mechanism of nature. The mere phrase is bewildering, but it deals with certain aspects of nature that science must concern itself with before long. Elemental agency cannot properly be regarded as belonging to the divine hierarchy even in its lower levels, but it constitutes a vast subsidiary evolution by itself. Cosmic in its character, related to much more than the interests of this world alone. Beginning on levels commensurate with the electron in magnitude and importance, rising to conditions in which definite forms in certain fine orders of matter are identifiable by observers, with adequately clairvoyant senses, as associated with specific functions in nature. Elemental constitute the link between will, human or divine, and physical manifestation. Obviously the subject is one of stupendous magnitude. No fire could burn, no plant could grow, no human being could live on the physical plane, and carry on all that business transacted within his body of which he is wholly unconscious, without elemental agency. When science comes to grapple with the intricacies of this so far hidden aspect of nature, it will look back to its present condition as one barely emerging from the dark ages. Thus vast and complicated is the agency by which divine will is fulfilled. But we have to struggle as best we may with the idea of hierarchies within hierarchies. The world is a theater in which a stupendous drama is in process of performance. The scenery and decorations are provided by divine agency, and the actors are responsible, if we push the metaphor to its extreme limits, for the parts they play. In other words, while divine agency invests them with their opportunity, their own free will is left to determine the use they make of this. But they must not be allowed to wreck the whole undertaking by too gross a misuse of that free will. The drama is intended to have a happy ending. So over and above or apart from the hierarchies that provide the conditions divine ordination provides for a governing hierarchy that does not actually control the actors, put words into their mouths, so to speak, or manage them like marionettes, but causes them to feel disagreeable consequences from blundering. Invests them with larger consciousness as they willingly fall into line with the divine idea. Of course that governing hierarchy is merged in its loftier levels with the superior agents of infinite divinity, but on its less exalted levels is in close touch with our own humanity. This thought leads up to what is perhaps the most important idea of all that I have been endeavoring to suggest. Humanity itself recruits the governing hierarchy. Its members on the first important level above ordinary humanity have been, at some remote periods in the past, human beings like the best of ourselves. We speak of them now, those of us who have the privilege of more or less knowing them, as great adepts, masters of wisdom, brothers of the Great White Lodge, or by any other phrases approximately appropriate. They are in normal periods equal to the task, under divine inspiration of which they, of course, are vividly conscious, of carrying the government of the world in so far as it needs adjustment or interference. They are our allies in this ghastly abnormal period in which humanity is confronted by an attack from such elevated levels of spiritual potency that, great as their power undoubtedly is, they can only for the moment resist the awful unseen foe inspiring our physical plane enemies, whilst awaiting intervention, ultimately certain if it becomes necessary, from lofty levels of divine power. Will this view of the great current crisis seem, to some critics, at variance with the main idea that this world, like all others, is governed by an infinite divine hierarchy of quite limitless capacity and directing human evolution from the realms of infinite love? The problem has been dealt with at some length in articles for the 19th century, and need only be referred to now. Free will, in one word, is the answer. The ultimate evolution of individual humanity can only be accomplished by investing each unit with the divine attribute of free will in a greater or less degree. Half-fledged humanity of the kind around us in abundance is hardly conscious of the extent to which it enjoys this attribute. It becomes more and more available as spiritual evolution proceeds. By the hypothesis it may be exerted to fulfill the purpose of divine love, in so far as that may be discerned, or it may be perverted to antagonize that purpose. Within the limits of our humanity the perversion may not be carried to any extreme degree. But other humanities have preceded our own and have reached exalted conditions in which free will for good or evil was enormously expanded in its scope. In that way it has come to pass that spiritual evil has assumed colossal proportions until at last it has challenged divine power on very high levels. That is the challenge with which we, on our humble level, are now contending. We feel sure of ultimate success because the mighty spiritual powers of evil, at war with the divine idea of humanity, on this plane with ourselves. The Allied armies, have had a definite origin that we can discern and have reached a definite height of spiritual power. However exalted that power, it is finite. The divine hierarchy is infinite. At whatever level satanic power may confront it on equal terms, divine resources above that level are limitless. If exerted they must subdue the finite power, and we have reason to feel sure that sooner or later they will be exerted to avert the ruin of the world. I have said that our allies in this great struggle, the masters of wisdom, or by whatever name we like to call them, the chieftains of humanity, of whose existence, till recent years, humanity at large was wholly ignorant, are recruited from amongst ourselves. Although none the less constituting the first great stage of advancement, counting from below upward, of the divine hierarchy. But while, beyond them, conditions of existence begin to transcend physical brain comprehension, we can understand to some extent the capacities and powers of the beings who have attained to them, and the functions appertaining to their stage of evolution. Certainly that mighty organization includes some who reached high spiritual dignity before this world's children had emerged from early races, in one sense their nursery. But none the less it includes some who have been to outward appearance within historic periods mere ordinary men. The world, indeed, has never been without a great ruling brotherhood, though at one time it was indebted for this to a senior humanity. The phrase needs amplification to be fully intelligible, but a very little thought will give reason to the idea that the history of this world and of our human races is not a complete short story, in itself, but an episode in universal history. As our humanity became sufficiently evolved to furnish recruits for the great ruling brotherhood, its existence was allowed to filter out gradually into the consciousness of the few candidates available. These were the few whose ardor in the pursuit of lofty knowledge and whose moral development were such that they could be trusted not to misuse enhanced knowledge. The world at large was not generally ripe for the proper appreciation of the fact that powers and knowledge beyond ordinary experience were attainable by certain means. A premature dissemination of that idea might have had unfortunate consequences. But for the chosen few it was revealed, and so it has come to pass that at the present day the Great Brotherhood includes many members who have been men like the best of ourselves within a comparatively recent period. Experience of ordinary life does not enable us to understand their place in nature altogether and completely. They work to a great extent on planes of consciousness beyond the cognition of the ordinary senses. They wield forces as yet unknown to science, using the physical body merely as a vehicle to be occupied or left aside as convenience may suggest. The finest clairvoyance which ordinary students of that wonderful faculty have ever met with is, compared with theirs, a rushlight to an electric arc. And physical matter itself is plastic in their hands. In the higher vehicles of consciousness distances about the world mean nothing, and withal they are of course in absolute harmony with the divine will. The view thus reached, that shows us the humanity to which we all belong as designed to recruit the first, as we look upward, of the spiritual degrees that in the aggregate constitute the divine hierarchy, is of supreme significance. Properly understood it invests humanity with an entirely new meaning, as compared with that which merely treats each item in that humanity as destined to an infinitely continued individual existence, happy or unhappy, as the case may be. The crude fancy thus presented to the mind by commonplace religion may have served its purpose while the world was young, as coaxing or warning an ignorant multitude not yet ripe for a more profound conception. But philosophically it is beneath criticism. The sublime idea, as directly affecting ourselves, to be derived from a conception, even if only broad and incomplete, of the divine hierarchy is that which shows it to be a coherent entirety stretching upward from this world as we know it, in the direction of absolute infinity. It enables us, for the first time, to comprehend this world's place in the universe. A misdirected modesty leads some of us occasionally to talk of this world as a small planet amongst many greater, attached to a tenth-rate sun in a universe richly stocked with others of enormously greater magnitude and brilliancy. The infinitesimal creatures on its surface can only be regarded, in this way, as important in their own estimation. No more so really than the grains of sand on the seashore. That view is no less erroneous than depressing. The humanity for the sake of evolving which this world exists, represents a definite stage in the evolution of divine consciousness, which, besides its limitless expansion towards infinity, is susceptible of infinite accretion from below. There are no stages in the divine hierarchy that have not been recruited, in some unfathomable past, from humanities more or less resembling our own. Eternity stretches both ways, and the world, the solar systems of today, though figures would fail to suggest their duration as measured in our time, are manifestations of divine power that have succeeded others and will be in turn succeeded. We count the nebulas in the heavens, and watch the growth of future suns destined to bear their progeny of future worlds and future candidates for divine evolution. But we need not torment imagination by following that thought too far. It is enough to know that here and now we are candidates for divine evolution. That there is no solution of continuity from this stage of existence up to those that have been faintly suggested in these pages and are hopelessly dazzling to mental vision as we dwell in thought on their attributes and power. This humanity of ours, even as we contemplate its visible varieties from the savage to the greatest philosopher, is obviously a vast procession moving through the ages. Each immortal spirit ever seeking new and new incarnations till gathered experience and effort entitle it to those of the loftiest order. The appreciation of this idea marks a huge advance beyond the primitive conception of an eternal perpetuation of each grotesquely incomplete being. But such an appreciation is merely a step in the direction of the grander conception. The highest level of moral and intellectual attainment, the stage of this world's potentialities, is but a new beginning, a point of departure for a progress beyond the precise comprehension of physically incarnate intelligence. But happily not altogether veiled from our view. No matter for the moment whether there be other worlds affording still more favorable opportunities for embodied consciousness. That is no concern of ours. We may be fully content to know that however the preparatory processes leading up to the divine hierarchy may be provided for in other worlds. This of ours has a place in the universe in direct relation with all the infinitudes that simple word represents, with all that the most illuminated reverence can suggest when we presume to speak of God. Future life and lives. Naturally enough, the tragedies of the war have imparted thrilling interest to some questions carelessly disregarded by the multitude during normal periods. Is there an afterlife for all of us when we die? Can we find out anything about it in advance? Can we communicate with those who have already passed on? Most current essays dealing with such perplexities have a ludicrous aspect for millions of spiritualists in constant touch with departed friends, for all occult students and for most psychic researchers. A writer in these pages last month calmly asserts that communication with the dead has never been definitely proved to be anything but delusion or fraud. If equally ignorant in other directions, he might deal in the same way with any scientific discovery, say, the retrograde motion of some planetary satellites, or the transmutations of radium. The vast literature of spiritualism is flooded with proof of the main idea. More recently, the literature of occult research is rich in detail concerning the conditions of the afterlife. To say that knowledge thereof has made no substantial progress whatever, is like asserting that since Galvani's experiment with frogs' legs our knowledge of electricity has made no progress whatever. Raymond, attracting deserved attention on account of its authorship, is only the latest contribution to innumerable records of a similar kind, the cumulative significance of which is overwhelming. While all who are patient and painstaking get personal conviction for themselves. Spiritualists for the most part are content with this. They know their departed friends still live and get assurance of their welfare. They look forward with confidence to their own future. Occult students find that, besides evidence of that order, minute information relating to the conditions of the afterlife can be obtained by people still in this life when gifted with clairvoyant faculties of an appropriate kind. Abundant information is accumulating in the literature of occult research along these lines. In no department of human activity has more remarkable progress been made during the last 30 years than in this branch of superphysical science. That progress has carried the occult student far beyond elementary discoveries relating to the immediate experiences of the next life. Certainly these are intensely interesting, but do not in themselves enable us to obtain a comprehensive grasp of the whole scheme of evolution to which humanity belongs. Comprehension of the next phase of life marks a great advance beyond the crass ignorance that doubts or denies even that, but it only helps us relatively a little way in the direction of understanding our place in nature and our ultimate destinies. Later developments of occult science enable us to appreciate both the value and limitations of spiritualism. The mediumship on which it relies is better understood now than at first. Physical phenomena are brought about when certain invisible factors in the medium's constitution can be withdrawn for use by elemental agency. Messages come through when certain organs in the medium's body respond to subtle vibrations that most people fail to perceive. But the medium in either case is a passive instrument in the hands of invisible operators, and these are of all varieties. That accounts for the nonsense that often discredits the method. The lower regions of the next world swarm with the, morally and intellectually, lower classes of humanity dying constantly by thousands, and, for a time at all events, remaining as unintelligent as they were in life. Their influences and messages are ignoble and stupid, but even then they serve their purpose. They show us in touch with another plane of existence. And meanwhile more enlightened inhabitants of that plane also communicate as the literature of spiritualism shows. But spiritualism, having broken down the deadly materialism into which thought was drifting during the last century, paved the way for the development of occult science. The later literature referred to above illuminates its origin and progress. The new view of evolution, of human destiny, and the economy of nature generally, which it has unfolded for us, cannot be fully interpreted within the limits of a review article, but may be broadly suggested. The stupendous conception of the future which shows that physical life has spiritual progress for its purpose, that this world is the region in which that progress has to be accomplished. That other realms of existence are the regions in which the work done here bears fruit, and provides for invigorating rest, leads us to the important conception that each physical life is merely one of a series. That whatever experiences intervene between each we shall all of us come back again and again to life of the kind we are familiar with here, that reincarnation is as certain a law of nature as the circulation of the blood. Reincarnation, when first scientifically defined some 30-odd years ago, was quickly seen to solve many previously insoluble problems. The hideous inequalities of human condition no longer seemed to insult divine justice. Suffering became intelligible when the conditions of each new life were realized as the consequences of previous doing, or karma. The superficial objection, that the sufferer did not remember his former misdoing, was dissipated as we realized that the higher self did so, and profited by each physical plane experience. Further knowledge showed that humanity is still in its youth. A few more advanced than the multitude do remember former lives. The whole course of reasoning need not be repeated here. The appreciation of rebirth as essential to a comprehension of human life is already widely spread. By reason of misunderstanding details, many people regard it with dislike, and the dislike has been accentuated by the eagerness of those who seized upon it at first to deal with it as though it covered all mysteries of the future. To think of the future as simply a return to this life is as great a blunder as to think of the life which opens up to the person just set free from the physical body, by its death, as entering an everlasting existence of a superphysical order. Only by failing to understand it correctly can anyone fall into the habit of criticizing the divine scheme of evolution unfavorably. The personality of a brutal criminal in the slums is clearly not lit for eternal perpetuation. The bishop in his palace, if he honestly considers the matter, will come to the same conclusion as regards himself. We are ancients of the earth, etc. And, as we look back on those who millions of years ago were more ancient still, we can see how better worth perpetuation we shall be when wider experiences of life shall have lifted us as far beyond our present condition as we now are beyond that of our Stone Age predecessors, ourselves in former lives. Probably, indeed, there will be no stage of growth from which the perpetuation of that stage would be conceivable. Spiritual progress must be infinite, but with that which lies beyond the perfection of humanity we can only be concerned much later on. Our present purpose should be to understand the laws of reincarnation so as to realize that it does not conflict in any way with the wide-ranging possibilities of life on higher realms after bodily death. And to understand that life so as to realize that it does not interfere with the necessity of returning here to gather fresh experience and get ready for loftier spiritual enlightenment on happier levels again. Those of us who have taken adequate advantage of modern opportunities need not speculate about the chances of survival after death. That is utterly familiar knowledge, and, with varying facilities, many of us are in communication with friends who have passed on. Though it does not always happen that these have acquired any scientific comprehension of their own destinies beyond the stage actually reached. Even for those of us here who have taken best advantage of current opportunities, there are horizons beyond which our knowledge does not extend. But the region in which people wake up after they have discarded the physical vehicle of consciousness is already a pays de connaissance for many of us, and there is pathos as well as absurdity in the fact that, for much larger numbers, conventional teaching has left them still in doubt whether there is any waking up at all. The astral plane is the term generally used by occultists to designate the vast realm of unseen life immediately surrounding this globe. It is not a well-chosen term, as the region in question has nothing to do with the stars, but it has become rooted in occult phraseology, and we cannot now escape from its use. It is really a vast concentric sphere of matter that does not appeal to our physical senses, far greater in size than the physical globe it embraces, including an enormous variety of conditions, some of them highly disagreeable. But of these it is needless to speak for the moment, as the vast majority of decently behaved people will have nothing to do with them but will pass at once, when free of the body, to regions where they will find themselves happier than they are likely to have ever been, even under favorable circumstances, in the physical life. Naturally, the character of such happiness is determined by the use that has been made of the earth life and the extent of spiritual development that the soul, or ego, has reached in its long progress through the ages. Its innumerable immersions in physical life, its former incarnations. The distribution of the varied conditions is well understood by those among us whose faculties are equal to the task of cognizing astral conditions, but for people who are not merely without such faculties, but have not been in touch with those who do enjoy them, some explanation is needed in reference to matter and sense perception. Without plunging into metaphysics in the direction of Berkeley, it is obvious that the reality of matter for us is due to the appeal it makes to our senses. Even on this plane, some kinds of matter, most gases, make no appeal to the sense of sight, but we know of them by means of other senses, other avenues to consciousness. But most of us have no senses through which astral matter can affect our consciousness. Many, however, have, and that is the whole secret of clairvoyance, the actuality of which as a faculty in some people is no longer the subject of any sane denial. Clairvoyance can in some cases see the forms in which astral life is expressed. For the most part, their astral senses are partially smothered by their association with physical senses. Those, however, who can, as the phrase goes, get out of the body, and exist prematurely in the astral plane, in the vehicle of consciousness that will not be in perfect order for use until the physical body, at death, is finally got rid of. Such persons become at once fully conscious of the astral realm, and, this is the important point to realize, cease for the time to be conscious of the physical realm. It does not exist for them any more than the astral world exists for the commonplace man in the street. All this is not guesswork or metaphysical speculation. It is the definite result of observation as scientific in its character as that concerned with astronomy or spectroscopic analysis. And the final result is that we are now in a position to know that when we look up into the sky and see nothing between us and the stars, we are really looking through a realm as rich in detail as the landscape we can see on a fine day from a mountain top. This region is inhabited by myriads of the human family, amongst them any we have loved and lost and will rejoin in due time, pending, at a far remoter date, our return together to this laborious nether world in which we have to work for any grand results above that may crown our ultimate endeavors. The astral world is not merely a concentric sphere surrounding the physical globe, it is, one within another, a series of concentric spheres, generally spoken of by occult scientists as subplanes. Counting from below upwards, the first and second, actually immersed in the body of the earth, are regions of suffering with which none but the very worst offenders against divine laws have anything to do. The third subplane, above the earth's surface, is still a comfortless region in which people who have been too deeply absorbed by the lower interests of physical life may have to spend a period of purification before ascending to happier levels. But this vast and highly varied range of experience may be ignored for the moment, as it need not disturb the apprehensions either of people who lead fairly wholesome lives while incarnated, or of the large numbers of gallant victims of the war who, on passing over, find the normal consequences of minor shortcomings obliterated by the sacrifice they have made of their earth lives in a noble cause. They, and the fairly well-behaved majority, will slip through the third sublevel without finding themselves entangled in it, and awake to consciousness on the fourth level of the astral world. The circumstances of which are almost infinitely varied, but on which, however varied, happiness is the underlying principle of all sensation and experience. Obviously, the conditions that make for happiness will be very different for people who, however creditable in a humble way their earth lives may have been, do not represent advanced intellectual development. The great man of science, for example, and the simplest maid-servant may share one characteristic. Both may regard some other human beings with genuine love. Their happiness on the fourth level will involve reunion with such persons if these have passed on first, ultimate reunion in either case. And if they have to wait for this, there will be partial reunion meanwhile, for the egos of people in physical life are, especially during sleep, in closer touch with the astral plane than they realize in the normal waking state. But the highly advanced egos, the great men of science and others, have capacities for the enjoyment of other astral opportunities over and above those relating to personal affections. On higher levels of the astral, to which such capacities would be automatically the passport, magnificent opportunities for the expansion of knowledge, along the lines already laid down in physical life, would open out. And for such egos centuries of glorious intellectual achievement are provided by the opportunities of the higher astral levels. They will all come back to incarnation eventually, for no matter how great they may be, measured by our present standards they are merely on the way towards the summit possibilities of human evolution. But there is no hurry, and as a matter of fact all the great scientists, poets, and artists of the last 300 years or more are still on the higher levels of the astral world, even though they may have access to still higher realms. And may avail themselves of that privilege from time to time. The higher astral levels, for intricate reasons, are especially adapted for the expansion of such knowledge and capacity as they generally desire. Those lofty levels share some characteristics with the fourth level but are less earth-like in their superficial aspect. The conditions of the lower fourth, for the subplanes include much variety, are curiously earth-like. Life there is free from all the tiresome lower needs we are troubled with, but people live there in houses, enjoy beautiful scenery and social intercourse, although the delightful principles that prevail there sort them, so to speak, into congenial groups, besides respecting the individual attachments of a genuine character passed on from the love experiences of the earth life. The progress upward toward sublime spiritual heights ultimately attainable by all human beings, is a gradual progress just as the acorn becomes the oak by degrees, not between today and tomorrow. If anyone is discontented with this explanation because he thinks of a beloved daughter, for instance, as turned into an angel of light, the day after her death, and in touch with the throne of omniscience, he has failed to appreciate the magnificence of the scale on which human perfection is gradually developed. Some of us may already be exquisite in goodness, as we measure character, some of us already splendid high intellectual grandeur, but infinitude is a long story. Eternity cannot be hustled. The achievement of the modern occultist has to do with the illumination of the relatively immediate future. And some details of that fascinating period are already within the range of our comprehension. Astral matter is plastic to the creative power of thought. With a vivid imagination here we can mentally almost visualize objects we might desire to possess. On the astral plane under similar conditions, the things desired, appropriate clothing, for example, pictures, furniture, houses even, would assume objective reality, and even durability when many creative thoughts cooperate. But as familiarity with the delightful freedom from body necessities that the astral life confers enables people gradually to realize that they do not need houses, furniture, and so on, those cease to make their appearance on the higher levels, where scenes of natural beauty provide for all the wants of inhabitants incapable of fatigue, hunger, or thirst, unconscious of either heat or cold. They may be fully conscious, none the less, of the intellectual interests they have been concerned with in physical life, and may continue in touch with the progress of art or discovery down here. In a way it is hardly possible to describe in a few words. This outline sketch of the astral life could, indeed, be filled in with much further detail and even be supplemented with some description of planes or spheres higher and beyond the astral. But in attempting to explore these, incarnate human intelligence is up against conditions that defy the resources of language. For every ego, indeed, each experience of astral life must come to an end sooner or later, though it may extend to many centuries of our time, and must almost always culminate in some touch with the lofty plane beyond. But for the humbler, less developed entities this touch would hardly involve consciousness, would merely be the prelude to an unconscious plunge back into incarnation. The better understanding of that plunge by the great many people in the present day who recognize the necessity of reincarnation as a principle, but dislike the idea for want of comprehending its method, is supremely desirable. The law applies to all, but is so elastic as to fit in with very different volumes of circumstance. First we must remember that egos ripe for reincarnation represent very different stages of development. The humblest of these, leaving out quite savage races that we need not think about for the moment, is not a very expanded being when, after a long stay on the astral, he has shed all memories of his last life and remains its spiritual nucleus. The law, guided by divine agency, puts that spiritual nucleus in touch with a new birth, and there is not much consciousness left on higher planes to be thought of as the higher self of the new personality. But in the case of the highly developed entity, astral experience, instead of obliterating unimportant memories, has enormously expanded those that are important. The ego as it stands ready for reincarnation is a being on the astral plane of immense complication, built up by the experience of many lives in the past, by that of many intervening astral episodes. He is probably something much more than can be fully expressed in its next immersion in physical matter. He will remain, all through the earth life to come, the higher self of the visible entity, of which the visible entity in its physical brain will have but little consciousness. But, by the hypothesis, enough of the real complete being will be expressed on the physical plane to make the new incarnation greater than ever along the lines of its former growth. If a great scientist before, a greater scientist again. If a great poet, a greater, and so on. But the point to be emphasized for the moment is that, while the new body is growing, the actual great intellectual being destined to use it at maturity is doing little more than looking on from above. If that idea can once be properly grasped, it does away with the fear some people seem to feel. To the effect that they with their present volume of consciousness will have to go through babyhood and all the experiences of the nursery when they come back to earth life. During all that time they will simply be looking on from above. To understand fully how it will come to pass that the baby and the young child will in a certain sense be conscious also, is very difficult for most of us, but, however faintly, that is what has to be realized. There is so little of the real ego in the new child up to 7 years of age that, if it dies within that time, the trace of consciousness it has been expressing simply reverts to the higher self, who makes another attempt a little later on and begins to animate a new form, not infrequently in the same family as the first. The mother's pretty belief that a later child is her first baby restored to her is often the outcome of a literal scientific truth. If all goes well, the first 7 years of the new child's life is spent in the growth of certain invisible accessories of the body, which medical science will sooner or later be concerned with investigating. And, again, the next 7 years are spent in further developments of the same order, but by the time the boy or girl is 14 a good deal of the real entity is beginning to express itself. Not the whole by any means, nor even the whole of that part designed for expression in the new life. But now the old astral is beginning to be wanted no more. In the new life the ego is forming for itself a new astral. The higher self remaining in touch with lofty planes will, for any expression it may need on the astral plane, make use of the new astral. Of course all these changes fade one into another like dissolving views. Nature is rarely addicted to abrupt metamorphoses. Mutatis mutandis, the process of incarnation as described above with reference to a well-developed ego is applicable also to people at intervening stages of growth. The return to physical life is never attended by inconveniently premature consciousness in the new body. Or this broad rule is only in rare cases partially infringed. Here and there, for example, young children have been known to show musical talent at a ridiculously early age. In such cases the ego of the great musician in the background is so eager to express itself on the physical plane that it cannot wait till the new instrument is properly tuned for the task. But even Mozarts who play the piano at 6 are not all there. Their condition is so exceptional that it need not be minutely examined in connection with any sweeping survey of the laws governing reincarnation. But one essential principle must never be forgotten. Guided by supreme wisdom and power, each new incarnation is conditioned by the merit or demerit of the ego returning to physical life. Students of heredity generally make the mistake of supposing that ancestral attributes are the cause of characteristics reproduced in the descendant. The descendant has been planted in that family because bodily heredity would there provide it with a physical vehicle qualified to give expression to its own inner nature. And, beyond this, because the circumstances of that life's program fit in with the requirements of absolute justice as regards the claims of the ego for happiness or its deserts as regards trouble. The infinite skill of the divine power regulating the details of each rebirth blends the intellectual or artistic necessities of the ego with a worldly environment appropriate to its moral condition, its good or bad karma, as the case may be. The working of this law is intensely interesting and marvelously intricate. The consequences of good or bad action in one life partly reflect themselves, to begin the explanation, in happiness or the reverse during the astral life. But that is only the first part of the story. A fundamental law, equivalent, on higher levels of nature, to the conservation of energy in mechanics, asserts itself with every entity coming back to incarnation in the earth life. Moral action, good or bad, must bear consequences from life to life. The external conditions, the happiness or the reverse of each life are the expression of forces set in activity during the previous life, or sometimes going back behind that, during previous lives. And, again, though they cannot controvert that law, aspirations in any given life, when sustained and intense, are an important factor in generating the environment of the next. To work with the simplest example, a person in a humble rank of life may be wishing all the time that he or she belonged to a superior class. The longing would have no effect if it were too vague. A carpenter thinking he would like to be a king does not know enough about the kingly life to long for it with precision. But he knows a good deal about the conditions of social life just a little above his own. He may or may not long for these, according to the measure of his contentment in his own station, but if he does long for them he does so with precision, with exact comprehension of what he wants. And then such longing becomes a natural force tending to color his next incarnation. And the principle really operates so widely as to bring about a gradual upward drift in social station of the innumerable egos emerging from the humble levels of existence. Of course that is merely a broad rule subject to frequent exceptions. Sometimes the karma of a life spent on high levels may necessitate a plunge to lower, but normally the aspirations of our life do contribute to engender the environment of the next. Thus in thinking of future life and lives we have to recognize the twofold character of the consequence ensuing from the manner in which each life is spent. That definitely affects both the immediate future and the ultimate future. More specifically it colors life the astral plane after the death of one body, and determines the welfare or suffering of the next incarnation. For people who have led fairly creditable lives the astral period is happy and restful, often associated with opportunities of doing useful work. Even when the previous life has been faulty in some respects, it may be that such misdoing has been of a kind so exclusively identified with physical life that it can only give rise to consequences on this plane again in the next earth life. But when the misdirection of activity has been of a kind that deeply colors the surviving consciousness of the ego, it may entangle him, when first passing on, in the third level of the astral world. That is a region of varied discomfort in which people have to realize the nature of their misdoing and shed the desires that have given rise to it. In bad cases that are not of the supremely bad order, the purification may be rather a slow process. But assuming that the character of the person going through it is tainted merely, not predominantly evil, the ultimate passage to the happy levels already, very imperfectly, described is assured, not merely in the long run, but very likely in a short one. In awfully serious cases the course of astral life is very different. There is one variety of human wickedness that is altogether in a different category from those that are mere vices. The sinful character of these, the mere vices, is often exaggerated. But cruelty, that worst and horrible form of cruelty which takes actual pleasure in the infliction of and sight of pain and suffering in others, is an attribute that drives the authors of such hideous misdoing down into that appalling submerged level of the astral world with which most of those even in need of purification have nothing whatever to do. Even that region must be thought of as purgatorial. Its fearful experiences may at last cure or begin the cure of the most ghastly offenders against the divine law of love, of which cruelty is the exact reverse. But imagination shrinks from the attempt to realize the details of the sufferings incidental to existence on the terrible submerged level. Their duration, in the worst cases, may be counted in centuries of our time. In others, a brief experience of this character may give rise to the needful revulsion of feeling. But though it would be unwise to attempt a survey of the astral world without taking cognizance of its lower depths, it would be worse than unwise to refer to them in any way that could excite fear on the part of harmless, innocent people. Too prone, as a consequence of clumsy religious teaching, to imagine themselves miserable sinners. Talk of that kind is for the most part silly nonsense, culminating in something much worse when associated with ghastly imaginings concerning eternal sufferings in hell. No decorous language is equal to the emergency in dealing with the criminal folly of those who terrify children and insult God by describing burning tortures to be inflicted forever on hapless victims of providential atrocities. Nature does provide a penitential reformatory for souls of diabolical criminality, but even their reformation is the purpose in view. It need only be thought of as completing the broad conception of after-death conditions that modern research in spiritual science enables us to form. For the poor innocent, miserable sinners, of the churches, the view we are now in a position to obtain of happy life on the higher levels of the astral world is that with which they are personally concerned. But that view even is in need of amplification. The merely happy restful life to which people of ordinarily good life may confidently look forward is not the only possibility that the astral world holds out. To understand the design of the future correctly, we must realize first of all that the whole scheme of evolution provides for a gradual progress, through many earth lives and many episodes on higher planes, towards a condition enormously superior to that yet attained by the most advanced representatives of current civilization on Earth. By most of the human family such conditions will ultimately be attained after periods of time that are bewildering to the imagination. But when the distant possibilities of human evolution are fairly well comprehended in advance, in the light of such teaching as occult research, and modern revelation, enables us now to deal with, we see that it is possible for those who appreciate the opportunities available to make a much more rapid progress than is provided for by the natural drift of events in reference to the multitude. Some members of the human family have been able to accomplish this long ages ago, and already stand on levels of progress on which have become agents of divine purpose in promoting the spiritual growth of mankind. These are referred to in occult literature as the masters of wisdom, and they are always ready to help forward the abnormal progress of people who have acquired some comprehension of their place in nature, and are filled with eagerness to get on as rapidly as possible in the direction of those great heights. The earth life is the opportunity for beginning such efforts. In this supremely important aspect of the subject, as in minor matters, the earth life is the period for sowing all spiritual seed. The astral life is the period in which it begins to bear fruit. A perfectly commonplace earth life, however harmless and innocent, bears appropriate fruit in the astral world and the shape of happiness and rest. An aspiration during earth life towards real spiritual growth, colored by such knowledge as is now available for all, bears fruit in the shape of personal touch with those masters of wisdom who may guide the aspirant to incarnations in which he may accomplish results the dignity and grandeur of which cannot easily be exaggerated. Something beyond mere personal happiness is then seen to be the object of attainment. This world is the expression of divine will, it is governed by divine law, but it is, so to speak, managed in detail by the agents of divine will evolved from the scheme itself. To become a part of, to be identified with that sublime agency, is the goal aimed at by those who fully realize the true meaning of spiritual growth. That such a condition involves a species of exalted beatitude which is something greater than and beyond personal happiness is a thought that may fairly be associated with true spiritual aspiration, but one that does not cover the whole idea. Too subtle perhaps for clear definition in language, though some trace of it should always color, for advanced thinkers, all reference to the changes inaugurated by each physical death. When the grave swallows any particular vehicle of consciousness that we have done with, it certainly marks an important stage of our progress through the infinitudes of life, and represents a very tiresome circumstance connected with this early period of human evolution. But only while we are suffering from the sad imperfections of conventional teaching is the grave surrounded with terror. The purpose of this article has not been merely to dissipate that terror, but to elucidate, for those who may long since have ceased to feel it, the detailed circumstances of the passage to the life beyond. And above all, to show how the all-important principle of reincarnation does not in any way conflict with natural aspirations for spiritual existence after bodily death. Reincarnation is no hurried process. There is plenty of time in eternity. Does anyone imagine that 1,000 years of spiritual life after the fatigues of this one will not be enough for him? If he continues hereafter to entertain that view, then he will have more. Or if he has no such far-reaching aspiration, and finds himself content with the simple enjoyment of the astral life on its less exalted levels, he will fall asleep and drift back to physical life in obedience to natural law at the appropriate time. And both in his case and in that of his more advanced contemporaries, the return to physical life will be accomplished as easily as the processes of sleep and waking during physical life, with the inner mechanism of which, for that matter, most people are no better acquainted than with the method of rebirth, the fullest acquaintance with which carries with it the most complete acquiescence in the wisdom, beauty, and harmony of the whole design. Religion under repair. On the 14th of April, 1917, The Times published an article entitled "Sheep Without a Shepherd," which, gently and without bitterness but in unequivocal terms, described the conventional religion of the churches and all their creeds as hopelessly out of date. Thinking men and women were represented as convinced that religion must be rediscovered from the beginning. The clergyman and his religion belong to a dead past. Thinking people turn away from the churches more and more as their interest in religion grows. What they need is a conception of the universe in which they may take their place. They believe in Christianity, but they need an expression of it that will satisfy intelligence. The time of cleansing for the Christian theology has been delayed so long that there is a danger lest the mass of men should think it all litter and dust of the past. The churches have fancied that the danger would be staved off by the slow, reluctant relinquishing of this or that belief as it became impossible. The real need is for discovery and growth. The Church must not be content any longer to talk pious nonsense in the hope that it will seem sense because it is pious. One might have supposed that so sweeping an indictment as this, directed against vested interests firmly rooted in social life, would have provoked a storm of criticism and a flood of sympathetic reiteration. Has orthodoxy preferred silence as on the whole safer than defense that would provoke fresh attack? If so, the fear is misdirected, because it is based on a misunderstanding of the attack. The clergyman accused of talking pious nonsense thinks the accuser an atheist denying God. The accuser is simply indignant with the clergyman for caricaturing God. There would still be a place for that clergyman among us if he could be taught to reverence God wisely. Has that attitude of wise reverence been attained by any of the earnest thinkers discontented with the clergyman's teaching? Has discovery really anticipated the demand for it set forth in the article quoted? Are there answers available for people who ask real questions about the nature of the universe? And may there not be already a considerable number of others who have profited during the last 30 years from wide publicity given to superphysical knowledge at one time reserved for a peculiarly qualified few? The true answer to that last question is in the affirmative, and those who have been concerned during recent years with the assimilation of ideas reflected in the higher occultism believe themselves, at all events, in possession of definite knowledge which meets the intellectual craving represented by the Times article. Many books convey this to all who care to read, and describe the sources from which it is derived. For some of us who are students of occult science and philosophy, the authors of the teaching given out are seen to have extraordinary claims on our trust. The nature of these claims can better be appreciated after we have fairly considered the general outline of the teaching they convey. It constitutes a complete response to the demand set forth in the Times article. It does give us a comprehensive view of the cosmos to which we belong. It embodies a revelation which is, for the world at large, a discovery of previously unsuspected truth concerning the fundamental facts of spiritual silence underlying all forms of religion. It does much more than this because it gives us a perfectly clear view of the course of human evolution, dissipating all the darkness that surrounds death, lighting up the conditions of the new life that immediately follows the change and pointing out the path to be ultimately trodden, leading to infinitudes of progress. The view of divinity, life and nature thus afforded, conveniently to be described as the higher occultism, makes its first claim on respectful consideration by its own inherent reasonableness. It is vast in its scope, widely ramifying in all directions, but perfectly coherent, scientifically harmonious, all parts of the whole mutually supporting each other. In one way, that is a difficulty for the beginner approaching the study of the higher occultism. The comprehension of, not necessarily the whole because the whole is an infinitude, but of a great volume of superphysical knowledge is essential to an adequate appreciation of its parts separately. But eventually when enough is grasped, conviction sets in as an intellectual necessity, and then, among other conclusions, the honest student realizes that the higher occultism has been a gift to the world from teachers who are obviously entitled to profound trust. But his perception of this is no longer needed as a guarantee of the teaching. It embodies its own confirmation. Perhaps this can only be fully appreciated after a more exhaustive study of superphysical science than can be provided for within the limits of a review article. But a mere outline sketch of the knowledge accumulating on our hands will go far towards justifying the claim made above. Indeed, the most elaborate attempt to deal with detail would still leave us gazing at remote horizons beyond which human vision cannot penetrate, but that is by itself a condition which tends to fortify belief in what can be seen. No theory which invested eternity with a beginning and an end could be otherwise than absurd. But while the idea of God, divinity, the divine principle, whatever phrase we prefer, expands into regions beyond the reach of understanding, we do find that in so far as this world is concerned, in so far, indeed, as the solar system is concerned, occultism presents us with an intelligible conception of the divine hierarchy. Also, as already affirmed, clearly illuminating the mysteries of human origin and destiny, the course and conditions of evolution, and the manner in which divine justice can be reconciled with the terrible irregularities of life in the physical world. It puts us in a position of intimate familiarity with the life on superphysical worlds surrounding our globe to which all pass after the change described as death. It enlarges our view of human destiny, to that extent that we see life on other planets linked with that of the Earth. And the whole solar system resolves itself into a definite divine enterprise, with an origin and purpose vaguely appreciable, though in touch with mysteries of infinitude and eternity which we need not, at this stage of our progress, attempt to fathom. Incidentally, occult science forecasts the future progress in various directions of physical science, and in some cases those forecasts, made 10 or 15 years ago, have already been overtaken by practical research. The proof of that last statement would involve a long digression, but is definitely available. As many of the conclusions arising from the discovery of radium were clearly set forth in a book entitled Occult Chemistry published many years before Madame Curie's luminous contribution to plain physical science. Indeed, laboratory research has as yet only partly overtaken the occult discoveries, though confirming them as far as it has gone. The claims for occult science just set forth may be examined one by one. It does not shrink from the use of the word God, except in so far as the word has been degraded by ignoble creeds. But supreme divinity is necessarily infinite and must have reference to manifestations in millions of worlds besides our own. And yet we feel sure that divine consciousness permeates this world. Occult teaching assures us that our own individual consciousness is a divine emanation, though limited in its scope and range of power by the vehicle or sheath in which it is working. For the moment, the idea is susceptible of expansion. All consciousness is a divine emanation, that working in animal forms, in vegetable forms even, also that working in superhuman forms on planes or realms of nature loftier than the physical. The idea at once leads to an appreciation of the sublime magnificence of the divine hierarchy intervening between our humanity and the nearest manifestation of the infinite divinity. Reasonable occultists do not presume to formulate a rigid conception of that nearest manifestation. But they know that the solar system is a definite enterprise within the manifested universe, and therefore that in some way it can be identified with a vortex, so to speak, in infinite divinity. And that is generally referred to as the logos of the solar system. Words are not well adapted to such thoughts, but we must be content to use the best we have got. The simple Christian who wants to discern a Father in God may be chilled by this awfully superphysical idea, but he need not be so if he clings to his faith in Christ, which the occultist has no wish to disturb. Medieval creeds which the churches perpetuate have caricatured the Christ idea, amongst others, but the occultist clearly understands Christ as belonging to the divine hierarchy, in close touch with this world. And that understanding carries with it a reverential feeling that no conventional Christian can possibly improve upon. Of course, the hierarchy of beings representing various stages of spiritual evolution and a vast variety of functions in nature includes sublime entities on all imaginable levels. But the fundamental all-important idea to be held firmly in thinking of the hierarchy is that it constitutes the agency through which the divine purpose is worked out in manifestation. This is one way in which a scientific complexion is put upon occult religion. Agency runs down to the minutest activities of nature. There is no break in the uniformity of the method. Archangelic beings fulfill the divine purpose on their levels. Elemental beings on levels of consciousness below our comprehension are agents in promoting the growth of plants, or carrying out the laws, the divine purposes, of chemical affinity. This last thought relates to a huge branch of occult science in a borderland that physical research must soon invade. A hierarchy that includes beings of the archangelic order, and also others of still loftier spiritual rank, together with humbler agencies below the level of humanity, concerned with the working of natural law. Must obviously also include beings but relatively little above the human level. And this thought illuminated by definite information brings the occultist into touch with a realm of knowledge bearing equally on the government of this world and the possibilities of human evolution. There is a level of the great hierarchy definitely recruited from humanity. Common conceptions of human evolution have correctly hit off the idea that it is recruited itself from lower forms of life. Prevailing belief, however, has not grasped the notion that it expands into higher forms without any break of continuity. At an earlier period in the world's history this was more generally appreciated than it has been in recent years. In ancient Egypt, for example, though the live or 6,000 years beyond which modern research does not extend were a mere decadent remainder as compared with still earlier Egyptian civilizations, the people generally knew that some few hierophants had risen to a high condition of knowledge and power as compared with ordinary humanity. Definite systems of initiation were known to lead upward towards those heights. Though later generations have lost sight of this deeply significant truth, it is still as true as ever. The, relatively, lower levels of the divine hierarchy are still recruited in that way. For recent ages the system has been veiled from common observation. The progress of humanity is worked out in accordance with a definite divine plan. For a time it was necessary that intelligence should be trained in the study of physical nature. The improvement of brain capacity was the task before the incarnate vanguard of humanity. Superphysical knowledge, the fascination of which would have attracted the pioneers of brain culture off the path designed for them, was hidden away for a time. Those men of science who resent the movements of thought bringing it to the light of day again are survivals of the regime to which they have not yet ceased to belong, unconsciously bearing testimony, amusing to the occultist, to the accuracy of his diagnosis. The principle just hinted at, that human evolution does not stop short at the stage reached by the most brilliant representatives of current civilization, leads on to the appreciation of the idea that infinitude is applicable to that evolution. As to the loftier conception of divine nature, the idea is best understood by tracing it back to some extent into the past. Consciousness, which eludes research in the dissecting room, is, in a certain sense, uniform in its nature. Incomprehensible as regards its essence, but vaguely acceptable as somehow of divine origin. As above pointed out, its scope and range are determined by the vehicle or sheath in which it is involved. The full development of that idea puts a new face upon the whole theory of evolution. In any animal form we like to think of, consciousness has obviously a very limited scope compared with our own. The splendid light Darwin threw on nature showed us the growth of form, following certain physical plane impulses. The occultist at first only found fault with the theory as ignoring the simultaneous evolution of consciousness. A clearer view has since been obtained. In the lower animal forms consciousness has not been individualized. But an aggregate volume of consciousness animating many lower forms gradually feels the need of animating higher ones. Fully developed, the description of the process would be very protracted. Eventually in the highest animal forms consciousness is individualized and passes under well-understood conditions into the human form, not at once into one of high development. By this time, however, the individualized consciousness may be treated as an ego subject to the law of reincarnation. At first its progress may be thought of as the growth of the ego, its spiritual growth going on concurrently with the improvement in the human form and the perfection of the brain. But how is this view to be reconciled with the theory that consciousness is identical in essence throughout nature? Quite easily, for all who profit by what is known concerning the laws governing reincarnation. Desire is one of them. Desire for an improved form providing improved scope for consciousness would be distinctly operative. But the man at a humble level does not know enough to formulate such a desire explicitly. He does it automatically by making the best use of the form, or vehicle, he has got. Natural law then gives him a better one in his next life and so on ad infinitum. The principle properly understood accounts for lofty as well as humble progress in evolution. The man in the beginning does not know what he wants, but gets it by unconsciously conforming to the law. On a higher level he obeys it consciously, and the result is the same. On all levels, of course short of those that are very exalted, action good or bad, karma, to use the technical expression, good or bad, hastens or retards the result. And a mere recognition of the laws concerning reincarnation and karma goes far to explain and justify the conditions of the world as we find it, with all its ghastly irregularities of physical and moral welfare. That is a huge branch of occult study by itself. But in tracing the manner in which humanity is linked with the divine hierarchy, the occult interpretation of the minor mysteries of current life on earth may be left aside for the moment. A profoundly significant phrase, borrowed, I believe, from some Oriental scripture, runs as follows: whatever is, has been, or will be human. Those few words cover the whole sweep of thought concerning the origin and destinies of man, the meaning of creation, the essence of all religion. Such thought, of course, melts into the incomprehensible if pushed backward or forward into the infinitudes of eternity, but is magnificently full of suggestion. That it accounts for all lower forms of life and the earlier conditions of this world is relatively uninteresting. It accounts for the divine hierarchy. That upward growth that we can trace from lower to higher forms of human life is nowhere arrested. Occult science has shown us from the first that living forms are not built merely of physical matter. During this familiar earth life, even fairly advanced representatives of humanity are capable of passing from time to time into vehicles of consciousness built of finer orders of matter than those which build up flesh and blood. The full development of that subject would claim a long dissertation, but for the moment the important point is that, though physical humanity is an essential phase through which differentiated consciousness passes, a time comes when physical form is needed no more, and progress goes on without any break in the process towards conditions of being that, contemplated in imagination from the physical plane level, seem to represent different orders of creation. Beings on that level are simply among the members of the divine hierarchy referred to by the words, has been, in the phrase quoted above. But that does not mean that they have been simply human at any period in the history of this planet. From the point of view of occult science, no world is a complete undertaking in itself. Life, the infusion of divine consciousness into matter, is a vast coherent phenomenon in nature, limitless in all directions. The idea may be approached by considering its bearing on the solar system, itself, as we are enabled now to realize, a coherent scheme of manifestation, all its parts interrelated one with another, and as a whole interrelated with a larger cosmos. Common astronomy deals with the magnitudes, distances, and movements of the various planets constituting the solar system, and to some extent with their relative stages of development. Jupiter, for example, is obviously a world in an early stage of its growth, because it is still hot, almost incandescent. Occult astronomy, which might be called vital astronomy, deals with the life going on in each planet, or for which each is in preparation. In most cases each planet is part of an, apparently, independent scheme of evolution. Thus the planet Venus belongs to a senior scheme A compared with that which the Earth represents. Human life there has already been carried to stages of growth enormously in advance of the stage yet reached here. But there, as here, individual growth has been affected by the play of individual free will, which presents no mystery to the occultist, and though a very large majority of the original human population of the Venus scheme have attained to highly exalted conditions, some have dropped off in the course of bygone ages. The egos having failed to attain conditions qualifying them to reincarnate among the more advanced majority. Their destiny is intensely interesting, as illuminating the economy of the solar system as a whole. There is no final perdition for the failures of each planetary scheme in turn. They pass on to the next scheme. The failures of the senior Venus scheme are merged in the humanity of the Earth scheme. The further details of this process are of increasing interest. The failures concerned, though left behind by the successful candidates for progress on Venus, fell off from their proper human family at a later stage than that generally reached so far by the foremost races, even, of the Earth scheme. So the present conditions of Earth humanity do not yet afford them appropriate incarnation. Nature deals with the difficulty in her usual competent fashion, but to make the solution intelligible the conditions of our own planetary scheme must be taken into account. In our case 3 planets are linked together in one comprehensive evolution. Of course, the reason of this is intelligible, but that would be a long story by itself and may be left aside for the moment. Our human family is at present distributed over 3 worlds, Mars, the Earth, and Mercury. Silly criticism based on ignorance may fall foul of this statement on the ground that Mercury, so near the Sun, must be too hot for human life. Too hot certainly for bodies of our flesh and blood, but the chemistry of nature can solve more intricate problems than those merely of temperature. Mercury bodies are adapted to temperatures in which our own could not exist. Now the main body of our human family is here on the Earth, but an inferior remnant at a very low and coarse stage of development, the dregs of our humanity, so to speak, is still on Mars. A vanguard of peculiarly advanced egos is already on Mercury, leading a more beautiful life than any of which the Earth's main body has yet had experience. That advanced vanguard supplies the Venus failures with suitable opportunities for incarnation, and the bulk of the Mercury population at the present time had to begin with a Venus origin. Of course, the numbers are not great compared with those of the Earth, taking those to include egos in and out of incarnation, in physical bodies, that is to say, and on the higher spheres surrounding the physical planet. The importance of the explanation just given turns on the way it shows the whole solar system as a coherent organism. For obviously the system now operative as between the senior evolution of Venus and the next in order, our own, will go on providing for the evolution, at remote periods in the future, of the outer planets, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus and Neptune. Circumstances will no doubt vary in these far-off regions of the stupendous divine program, but the leading idea establishes the unity within diversity of the plan that the solar system represents. This light though comprehensive sketch of the divine plan will enable the reader incidentally to understand how the students of occult or vital astronomy obtain their information. Obviously of a kind that commonplace physical faculties can possibly deal with. We see human evolutions extending upward, without any break of continuity, to the nearest levels of the divine hierarchy. We realize the unbroken continuity of consciousness beyond those levels, so that knowledge of the kind that seems at the first glance to belong to divinity itself must filter down to the lower levels of the divine hierarchy. Then we begin to understand how the beings on those levels, in touch in one direction with relatively infinite wisdom, in the other with ordinary humanity, may see fit to pass on to some qualified pupils in ordinary humanity some information illuminating the world and the cosmos to which that ordinary humanity belongs. Indeed, it is obvious that sooner or later such information must be passed on, to provide for the fulfillment of the divine plan. At earlier stages of growth humanity was not in need of all this lofty teaching. It had to accomplish certain achievements. Now, from the higher point of view, essential preliminary undertakings. Humanity had to learn simple broad principles of moral science, to grapple with the vague idea that there was some divine mystery pervading the world. The religions of various periods met this need with more or less success. It did not much matter at first that they were irrational in their design. In days of one early papacy, for example, when priests disputed as to whether Christ was the real Son, or an adopted Son, of God, religious intelligence was not ripe for more suitable discussion concerning the divine hierarchy. The writer of the article on "Sheep Without a Shepherd" seems to think the clergy of the present day are not much more ready for it. However this may be, some of them must be ready, and outside the Church a sufficient number have been found ready, to justify the full flow of the teaching which this paper partly embodies. Then, again, for the last 1,000 years or so, humanity has been getting ready for higher teaching by perfecting its thinking capacity. The study of physical science has polished human brains to a high degree of delicacy. That had to be done before religion could be leveled up. Habits of scientific thinking have certainly paved the way for appreciating the credibility of occult teaching, better than the mental training of the theologian plodding in the path of medieval creeds. A considerable number of people thus prepared are ripe for superior enlightenment, more than ripe, definitely craving for it. It has become incumbent on the custodians of the superior knowledge to give out that knowledge far more freely than was necessary or desirable in the past. Only as we become possessed of the knowledge can we appreciate the obligation. The further growth of humanity towards higher conditions of being can only be accomplished by a humanity comprehending its purpose and potential destinies. That level of the divine hierarchy nearest to and immediately above ordinary humanity has to watch over, guide, and promote the spiritual growth of that ordinary humanity. As those ready for new conditions become more and more numerous, the work of those who link humanity with the hierarchy becomes more and more important and exacting. The occult student generally refers to those who are the links in question as the masters of wisdom. The title will serve for the moment, though we may eventually adopt a better. Whatever name we use, they are the immediate agents of divinity in carrying out the design in which this world and its inhabitants play a part, and, as time goes on, and they have more and more to do in a world ripening by degrees, their numbers must be recruited. That can only be done as the more advanced claimants for spiritual enlightenment are mentally and morally cultivated. The evolution of a humanity, in fact, is analogous to that of a single entity. In childhood his growth, well-being and education depend on others. Teaching gradually enables him to realize that his own will and effort must be brought into play to accomplish growth beyond a certain stage. His later development must depend upon himself. So with humanity at large. The evolutionary law works under loftier guidance for a time. But the race cannot improve beyond a certain stage without understanding its place in nature, without realizing the sublime truth that it must for its later development guide its own evolution, govern itself. We are now at an important turning point in the world's history. Even as the situation might be considered without reference to the enormously significant fact that the superphysical powers of good and evil are engaged in the fiercest struggle for supremacy that has ever been waged in the whole history of the solar system. The issue of that struggle is not in doubt. Beyond the horrors of the final crisis there stretches the assured vision of a beautiful future. But its beauty will be partly due to the continual expansion of the knowledge which has been gradually pouring into our hands during the last 30-odd years. The ever-growing appreciation of which is no less certain than the ultimate defeat of the satanic power hitherto directed, among other purposes, to stifle and impede its dissemination. That defeat accomplished, the world's progress along desirable paths will proceed with a rapidity for which previous experience has prepared us. And the influence of that comprehensive view of nature and divine truth that has hitherto been occult, veiled or partially obscured, will permeate religious thinking and soon lead to a reconstruction even of the orthodox clerical presentation thereof. So that there will no longer be any inclination to regard that as litter and dust of the past. The unseen laws governing the world and human evolution, the conscious agencies through which they are administered, the higher realms of life intimately associated with the physical life on the earth's surface. will all come within the range of human understanding in a near future and will bring about such a blend between science and religion, that each will be regarded as the complement of the other, the piety of the Church no longer nonsense in the sight of science, and the critical insight of science no longer a terror for a Church which will lean on it for support. Religion under repair, a reply to Professor Lindsay. Endeavoring to frame a crushing rejoinder to my attempt to show that conventional religion is badly in need of repair, Professor Lindsay, writing in the 19th century, provided his readers with so fair a summary of its contents that he is entitled to my thanks for bringing these afresh to the notice of any among them who may have overlooked their first presentation. But in failing to appreciate their importance he shows clearly how minds untrained in the study of nature's superphysical mysteries are embarrassed with prepossessions partly derived from medieval theology and partly from materialistic habits of thought prevalent in the last century. Current thinking meanwhile has been deeply colored by the recognition of some capacities of human consciousness that transcend the physical senses. There are still many amongst us who resent subtle discoveries outrunning their own experience. What they can't understand they refuse to believe, and must be left in the rear of mental progress. But for those who do not protect their opinions by carefully guarding their ignorance, some broad convictions, at all events, are gathering strength. Foremost among these is the certainty that there are avenues to perception over and above those provided by the physical senses. If anyone now denies the possibility of clairvoyance, he does not express an opinion. He merely shows himself unacquainted with certain developments of scientific research. Again, while crowds of blatant assailants abuse the multitudes who know that they have touch with conditions of human life following on the change called death, disbelief in that matter where it exists is merely due to ignorance of the work done in that department of research. Those who challenge either of the statements just made are not entitled to attack a writer who takes them for granted. The literature dealing with them is abundant. No one addressing intelligent hearers concerning any fresh development of superphysical research can be fairly called on to waste his time in going afresh over the rudimentary discoveries of 50 years ago. A modern chemist, writing about the atomic weight of thorium lead, does not include in his essay an elaborate argument to show that the measurement of atomic weight is possible. The stream of criticism Professor Lindsay directs against my exposition of lately expanded teaching concerning human and superhuman evolution may be partly summed up in the question, how do you know? Expressed in various phrases, few of which offend good taste in their form. But the answer is embodied in the various books I have written in the last 30-odd years, and I do not want to go over all that ground again. I will summarize it briefly, recognizing this as by far the most important question that can be put by anyone meeting with the later results of occult research before having grown familiar with the earlier achievements of that great undertaking. But in the first instance I am tempted to deal with some amusing objections leveled by the professor against various assumptions I have ventured to put forward as in no need of elaborate proof. My remark that occult research anticipated many of the conclusions arising from the discovery of radium is twisted into a statement that it anticipated the discovery of radium, and treated with sarcasm accordingly. The fact, as I stated it, is simply indisputable to anyone who will take the trouble to read the book I referred to, Occult Chemistry, and observe the date of its publication. It is obviously impossible to repeat the contents of that book here. It will be found deeply significant for all persons interested in chemical science. Pantheism. There is some resemblance between the true doctrine and the speculation going by that name, just as there is some resemblance between metempsychosis and reincarnation. But also all the difference that there is between a lump of gold-bearing quartz and a finished gold coin. Spinoza's pantheism absorbed God in nature and left no God behind. Occult pantheism recognizes nature as an emanation of God, but also recognizes the infinite, supreme, divine incomprehensible being of omnipotent consciousness which is God, as losing nothing by its infusion into matter. Thus occult pantheism includes deism while clearing that conception of its limitations. It is true that almost all the finished mental products of modern occult research have been crudely anticipated in a great many early philosophies and scriptures. The splendor of their modern presentation is due to the extraction of the interior truth from the rough or, its restatement in terms of Western scientific thinking. That is the answer to the objection that my theory is as old as Gnosticism, and to the somewhat inane charge that my pretensions to unfold a new and satisfying cosmic worldview are simply ridiculous. That which is ridiculous is the suggestion that in its present form, with modern scientific precision and detail, it can be found either in Gnostic writings, or even in Sanskrit Upanishads, with which by the way our professor may not be intimately acquainted as he refers vaguely to Hindu philosophy. That phrase might be paralleled by a Hindu who should refer to the European language as though there were only one. It may be in a certain sense true that there is nothing new under the sun, but as time goes on old ideas get sometimes so embellished by advancing knowledge that they seem the product of a new revelation. That is emphatically true of the cosmology developed now by students of what, for want of any better term, I have called the higher occultism. Reincarnation. Our professor thinks it has never found favor in the West. I think it is commanding the assent of all intelligent people, whenever it is understood. Unhappily it is very widely misunderstood, as by our professor, obviously, when he describes it as a paralyzing doctrine of which fatalism is the natural outcome. The natural outcome is exactly the reverse, because it shows each life in turn the expression of causes set in motion by the free will of the ego in former lives. Again, complete explanation of the real doctrine would claim very many of these pages. That doctrine is fairly set forth in my own published writings, but I do not feel entitled to advertise them here. If anyone thinks, along necessitarian lines, that acts in each life are inevitable, and therefore, as causes, encouraging fatalism, the answer is, firstly, a contradiction of the assumption arising from our knowledge of the way karma is adjusted by the elemental agents of the Lipika. I use technical phraseology for the moment, to hint that in dealing with the higher occultism I am skirting the confines of an elaborate science. The words used above will have a definite meaning for every theosophical student, and will, I venture to think, be quite destitute of meaning for the professor. Secondly, the reason why incarnation provides for intellectual, moral and spiritual growth and expansion is to be discerned in the fact, so ill understood by the materialistic science of the last century, that thought is a force. Again, that is a statement that people ignorant of all that has been done in psychic research during the last quarter of the last century will not understand, and, therefore, will foolishly deny. The influence of thought on future incarnations has been elaborately traced in my own and other current books. In truth it determines their course. And, when understood, reincarnation becomes not only acceptable but the only thinkable method of carrying on human evolution. Some people are frightened of it, because they foolishly imagine that it means their own individuality and consciousness immersed in a baby form, and miserable in such a condition. Their consciousness during the baby period will be on a higher plane in another vehicle. They will not enter their new bodies till these are mature far beyond the stage of the nursery. How can I convey a glimmer of the truth in a few words? The spiritual entity of an advanced representative of a highly civilized race may be older than this world. His or her incarnate personality, in any given case, may be only a partial incarnation. There is a higher self, the part of the whole self, on a spiritual plane all the while. Clairvoyance, adequately endowed, can see the law at work. Mesmeric practice will often enable one to get touch through a personality with his or her higher self. And thus not merely verify its existence but acquire voluminous information concerning the conditions of the superphysical realms of consciousness belonging to this world. These become so familiar to the qualified occult investigator, that current discussions as to whether they do really exist or not are more ludicrous in his sight than the outsider who never concerns himself with such inquiries can easily imagine. And students of occultism will be even more amused by the professor's criticism to the effect that their studies throw no light on the problems of life and consciousness. Their literature is saturated with ethical teaching of an exalted order, which bears on every imaginable problem of life and consciousness. Some theosophical writers, indeed, are so dominated by the thought that nothing matters except the cultivation of the loftiest moral virtues, that they are less interested in the knowledge concerning the previously hidden mysteries of nature which it has been my special business to unveil as far as possible. To say that the higher occultism, which embraces or includes theosophy, does not concern itself with moral problems, would be like saying that the branch of science called physics does not concern itself with electrical phenomena. So now let me turn to the supremely important question Professor Lindsay puts impressively, with reference to a statement I made about Venus and Mercury. How does he know? Quite unconsciously he answers his own question when, intending to be satirical, he says, Mr. Sиннет would appear to have sources of information not generally available. Precisely so. I first came into touch with those sources of information in the year 1879, and a year or two later wrote a book, The Occult World, fully detailing the circumstances under which I obtained that touch. And some of the intellectual results that ensued from it. That touch has been maintained to the present day, and it is hugely important that the consequent authenticity of theosophical and occult teaching should be properly appreciated. Explanation of the reasons which led many of us to trust them in the beginning, and of experiences confirming that trust in later years, is thus due not so much to any casual critic exhibiting hostile incredulity, as to the ever-increasing multitudes who are sympathetically attracted to occult teaching on its own inherent merits. Already the Theosophical Society, which does not by any means exhaustively comprehend the vast movement of theosophical thought, numbers, according to last year's general report, 989 distinct branches or lodges all over the world, with 280 members, leaving enemy countries out of account. In the interest of these, now constituting the second generation of theosophical members. For I am almost the only survivor of quite the first generation, as well as in the interest of the far larger numbers who will assuredly appreciate theosophical teaching as time goes on. It is supremely desirable that the actuality and nature of that occult world described, very imperfectly, in my first book should be correctly realized. All knowledge on which our welfare depends must be constantly brought up to date. A conviction once definitely and justly established in the mind ought never to fade, but for many people such convictions require to be refreshed from time to time. So, in reply to an inquiry, which on its own merits alone need not perhaps have claimed very earnest treatment, but may have a dull, wide echo if undealt with, I shall venture to explain once more how I know, and what are my sources of information. The great developments, as far as they concerned myself, began in 1879, and, though the professor thinks that Madame Blavatsky and the Mahatmas are a little demode, the events of that period paved the way for supremely important results. As anyone who will read my first book will see, Madame Blavatsky exercised abnormal powers. It is futile to suggest that later on she was accused of practicing imposture. These accusations related to events occurring long after I left India. They are scorned by the multitudes who still reverence her memory, but it is not my business to deal with them. The record of her magical doings which I put forward has never been challenged. Nor can it be challenged except on the hypothesis that I am not telling the truth. If things occurred under the circumstances I describe, no possible theory can be framed to account for them except the theory that she exercised power over forces of nature as yet unknown to science, producing effects that were a defiance of conventional beliefs relating to the natural laws governing matter. No critics of my story accuse me of intentional falsehood. They would be laughed at by the large number who know me if they did. They may accuse me of having been deceived, but that accusation falls to the ground for all who read my records, because, if things happened as I described them, there was no room for deception. That position could only be established afresh by a tedious recapitulation of definite occurrences, and it is useless for critics to assail it unless they will refer to the original statements and show how, under the circumstances, there was room for imposture. For the moment I must be content to repeat that such showing is impossible. I was far more deeply interested at the time than anyone can be now, in eliminating from the experiments I made all possibility of fraud. Anyhow the result was that I came to know that Madame Blavatsky exercised, or was the agent through whom were exercised, supernormal powers. That made me inclined to listen to her statement as to how such powers were obtained. The statement was to the effect that they were a relatively feeble reflection of mightier powers and wider knowledge possessed by certain men whom she had personally known, members of a great brotherhood representing a higher stage of human evolution than had been attained by the foremost even of those representing the progress of scientific knowledge in the open world at large. This statement, though striking and impressive, did not seem to me incredible. Why should human perfectibility after crossing such gulfs as those which separate our greatest exponents of intellectual evolution, Faraday, Newton, Copernicus, Pythagoras, etc., etc., from the man in the street, not to speak of the savage, why should it stop short at the stage represented by the names quoted? Nor was any mental difficulty involved in the idea that still loftier stages had to do with knowledge, and powers ensuing from it, that could not desirably be diffused through the world at large in its present stage of development. That is obvious, and it accounted for the reserve and seclusion of the advanced, masters of wisdom, or, to use the favorite Eastern term, the Mahatmas. When I began to write about them, shallow-minded readers fastened on a story which lent itself to derision, while more intelligent listeners in large numbers began to think seriously of theosophy. The comprehensive term assigned to the new views of natural philosophy opening out before us. Satisfied myself, to go back to the beginning, that the exponents of the higher knowledge must exist, I was eager to get into touch with them, and succeeded. First a protracted correspondence began. How did letters pass between myself and unknown correspondents, in Himalayan seclusion? By that time I knew, see the occult world, that occult power could transport physical objects through space. I found that the master could take my letters by means unfamiliar to the post, could give me the answers in strange and unexpected ways. But the wonder of this grew gradually subordinate to the importance of the communications themselves. Moreover, it was eclipsed by personal experiences of a supernormal character that put me in closer touch with the occult world than that established by the correspondence. I am now merely sketching the course of events. To describe them in detail would mean rewriting some of my books, but the sketch will, at any rate, suggest the nature of those sources of information which are within my reach, though not generally available. And a moment's reflection will show how reasonable it is to believe that the masters, to use the Western equivalent for the Indian word Mahatma, are able, if willing, to give such information concerning the other planets of the solar system and its general design as that which I made use of in my former Article 3 for the 19th century, and in many books. Common knowledge here amongst us relating to the capacities of our own clairvoyance, though there are people claiming to be cultured who remain absolutely ignorant of them, shows us the way in which senses finer than the familiar five will reveal what is going on at great physical distances. Developed by masters of superphysical science, is it surprising that they should reach out to other worlds of our system? Again, amongst us everyone following the progress of modern psychic research will know that it is possible for the consciousness, soul, ego, call it what you like, to pass out of the physical body for a time during life. To bid a conscious goodbye to the physical body left asleep, and roam the spaces of the astral world immediately around us, bringing back recollection of such excursions when resuming the use of the physical body. And during such excursions it may be possible, for those permitted, to have speech with masters, as well as with lesser human entities who have gone through the change called death, and thus learn lessons of priceless interest. There are indeed other ways of gathering in such teaching, and these have been to some extent at my service since the faraway days of the beginning that I have been describing, up to the present time. I am now in a position to deal, much more definitely than then, with the functions of the masters in connection with the government of the world and of the stupendous divine hierarchy to which they belong. Vast numbers among us are ripe now to appreciate this revelation, though other vast numbers are still intellectually cramped by conventional prejudice from which they cannot escape. And it is to those thus ripe that I venture to address what remains to be said, rather than to assailants impatient with the disturbance of their cherished limitations. The condition described as mastership can only be attained by the sanction of still higher authority. When the moral and spiritual evolution of the being in question has reached a condition which I have described in an earlier writing as follows. When he is in a position to survey the whole process on which the human family is launched. From its beginning in the remote past to its conclusion in the almost immeasurably distant future. When all the natural laws and forces which play round it lie within his comprehension and grasp, whether they are operative on the physical plane with its wonderful complexity of molecules and forces, or on those other planes invisible to ordinary sight which interpenetrate it or surround it and are more bewildering in their complexity still. When all the myriad enigmas of good and evil, of sin and sorrow, and hope, are resolved into intelligible meaning, and neither the earth below, nor the heavens above, nor life, nor death, hold any riddles from his understanding, the adept is qualified to attain the final rank in the vast concatenation of progress we have been surveying. Concurrently with the advance in knowledge and power thus suggested, the master has been correctly described by another writer as necessarily endowed with perfect compassion, an absolutely selfless devotion to the welfare of all sentient beings, and a boundless love and fellow-feeling for them all. It has been my privilege in recent years to pick up some bits of information concerning former lives of some among the great masters, and these have illustrated what the writer just quoted meant by absolute selflessness, in a way that has thrilled me with emotion, though on the higher level self-sacrifice is taken as a matter of course. How, it may be asked, can a being on the master's level be in a position to incur self-sacrifice? If his body is menaced by injury or destruction, he can quit it at will and assume a new incarnation if he chooses. Undoubtedly. But though he may have been doing that at intervals, very protracted intervals, for a long series of ages, he may sometimes as a definite duty, to fulfill some peculiar purpose, take quite a humble or commonplace incarnation in the ordinary world. He will never in such cases be known as a master in the ordinary world, but he may, for reasons connected with the welfare of other people, choose to remain with them and die, even a painful death in the ordinary way. Though he might had he chosen have slipped out of the body without incurring the least inconvenience, or, as Apollonius of Tyana is said to have done when before Domitian, vanish from sight and remove himself from danger by occult means. Nor indeed does the mere exchange of one body for another mean any trouble for the adept of master rank. He can keep any one going for periods measured in centuries that dazzle our imagination, but in the course of ages may find it convenient to take new ones from time to time. And this thought alone is one which will help to dissipate the erroneous notion prevalent in the beginning of the theosophical movement, to the effect that there was something especially Eastern in the higher adeptship. The master of occultism is bound by no limitations of nationality, will be sometimes in an Eastern as often in a Western incarnation. He belongs to the world. Not to any single section of its people, however large that section may be. The main idea in relation to the masters that I want to enforce is this: they belong to the divine hierarchy that presides over the evolution of mankind, and as regards their work in guiding human progress, as definitely as they are able, are absolutely at one, in thought and intention, with the still higher agents in that sublime hierarchy. They may not always find it possible to steer humanity exactly as they would wish. We, in this life, collectively constitute a craft that often fails to answer to the helm. And, as I endeavored to explain in a former article entitled Our Unseen Enemies and Allies, for we are terribly mixed up with inimical agencies bent upon interfering with the divine purpose at every available opportunity. If it were not for the ceaseless, untying efforts of our unknown protectors to shield us from the consequences of such attacks, the civilization of the world, the further evolution of the whole human race, indeed, would be utterly wrecked. For various reasons it is highly desirable that the world should understand this. The services the masters render us, in harmony with the influence of the whole hierarchy to which they belong, would be rendered just as zealously, however ignorant we might be of the benefits conferred upon us. Divine agents do not work for reward. But if the matter is rightly understood, it will be seen that we are the people who would be richly rewarded, if we became cognizant of the benefits conferred, and were, so to speak, grateful accordingly. It is true, indeed, that if such gratitude were widely felt and associated with clear comprehension of the way in which our elder brethren, the unseen masters, are struggling on superphysical planes with the powers of evil on our behalf, they would in a certain degree be strengthened in the struggle they are earning on. Success does not depend on such reinforcement of strength, that is certain and assured, but the duration of the struggle, on which the duration of the war depends, might be to some extent affected in the way above described. Meanwhile, the more subtle reward we should secure by gratefully appreciating the protection afforded us has to do with a law of nature familiar to the occultist, and of growing importance to humanity as evolution proceeds. Spiritual help of the kind affecting the spiritual welfare and progress of each human unit can only be rendered by higher beings in response to aspiration from the level of this life. We must look up, in order that they may look down, in the manner affecting individual progress. The progress of the world collectively will go on, anyhow, when the terrible crisis through which it is passing is over, because some of us will assuredly be looking up, and these in the course of time will drag on the rest. In that way the evolution and progress of the race, as a whole, is provided for, but it will be appreciably accelerated if those who look up, in the way described, become appreciably more numerous than the mere laws of average would ensure. And the acceleration of progress, as regards the upward lookers themselves, might be more remarkable than they can readily imagine. Not indeed that such a spiritually selfish motive ought to be mainly operative in bringing about the state of feeling that should prevail. From the point of view of the mere occult student on this plane of life, it is disgusting that the great multitude around us should be, so to speak, sopping up the benefits conferred upon them by the masters collectively and failing even to feel decently thankful. Any master who may take cognizance of this that I am writing would, I fancy, laugh at the notion that they could be supposed to want gratitude, but none the less all that I have written above holds good. And anyhow I know that they are eager to help all who are ready to be helped, and therefore are more than pleased when such help is consciously invoked. At earlier stages of the world's growth they had to remain concealed. The stake and the torture chambers of the church awaited those who tried to proclaim any faith nobler than that of the priests. The masters had to bide their time. But their time has now come. The world ripe to have its religious thought leveled up to harmonize with the sublime realities of divine government, and the dangers of allowing spiritual truth to be set free from medieval corruption have at last become negligible. A good deal in advance of the modern occult development, a book called A Suggestive Inquiry into the Hermetic Mystery, published 50 years ago, gave out some information about alchemy, the occultism of the Middle Ages, that some devotees of that study at the time thought dangerously frank. The author answers the criticism by anticipation in words which I will leave, in conclusion, as applicable also to such explanations as it has been my privilege to put forward. If we have been free in our expositions, the spirit was not the more reckless, but because the thresholds of ignorance are already overpassed. They are all now incredulous who were formerly dreaded in their belief, and under that safe guardianship we leave them happily supine in the conviction that our conduct will neither be attractive nor intelligible, much less practically useful, to the profane multitude of mankind. The occultism in Tennyson's poetry. A few among the great host of his devotees who, besides appreciating the varied beauties of Tennyson's poetry, are in touch with modern developments of the higher occultism, will be alive to the significance of some hints scattered through his writings showing how he, in advance of modern developments, intuitively divined some important principles now emerging from obscurity into the light. Even highly cultured and appreciative readers, unless also students of occultism, may pass them by unnoticed. Sir Alfred Lyell, for example, in his generally admirable survey of Tennyson's work, contributed to the series of English Men of Letters, overlooks some glaring hints of the kind in question. While actually dealing with the mere literary charm of one poem mainly devoted to the presentation of occult ideas. The elucidation of the passages thus hinting at hitherto hidden mysteries of spiritual nature is the purpose of the present article, but it must not be held to imply that the writer seeks to enroll Tennyson in the ranks of professed occultists. Of course, the splendor of his genius shone chiefly in his treatment of purely human emotion. And we, who have passed through life side by side with the poetic stream of his creation that flowed through the greater part of the last century, have derived our most intense pleasure from the perfection of his earlier verse. Apart from the beauty of the thoughts it conveyed. Then came the Idylls of the King in their stately magnificence, but they have nothing to do with occultism. A truly great poet can never be a specialist in any one vein of creation, though in whatever vein he is following, Tennyson seems for the moment to be a specialist in that. The Lady of Shalott, The Day Dream, The Lotus Eaters, and many others of that period, surpass in their musical charm any previous verse in English literature, though Byron and Moore sometimes touched the same level. And the way in which Locksley Hall might be criticized, like Hamlet, as full of quotations, shows how Tennyson was a specialist among poets in coining phrases that linger in universal memory. While the Idylls of the King lead some of us to forget that the supreme master of blank verse was equally unrivaled in dealing with rhyme. But after all, however highly we may appreciate his art, that merely renders the surface worthy of the substance of his poetry. So much in advance to show that the interest some of us may take in the flashes of occult inspiration to be discerned in Tennyson's poems need not separate us from the sympathy of worshippers who live in a more familiar atmosphere. Nor from the point of view of occult students, who have profited by the flood of light let in of late on mysteries previously obscure. Will the flashes in question show that Tennyson was completely in possession of knowledge which humbler mortals at the present day are inheriting without an effort? Indeed, innumerable allusions to death and the hereafter in memoriam are hardly tinged with any philosophy deeper than ordinary religious feeling, and in the two voices the second voice, which sweeps away the comfortless reasoning of the first, offers merely a little hint to solace woe. A hint, a whisper breathing low. A mere, hidden hope. And yet the same poem contains a passage that might almost be reckoned among the flashes of inspiration, suggesting the theory of life now reduced to a scientific shape. And gradually winning consent in all directions, the doctrine of reincarnation. I cannot make this matter plain. But I would shoot, however in vain, a random arrow from the brain. It may be that no life is found, which only to one engine bound falls off, but cycles always round. As old mythologies relate, some draught of lethe might await the slipping through from state to state. As here we find in trances, men forget the dream that happens then, until they fall in trance again. I need not expand the quotation. The poem from which it comes will be familiar to all Tennysonian enthusiasts, and the passage to which I call attention embodies a thought far more fully treated in later utterances. But before dealing with them it is worth while to turn back to one of his very earliest fragments entitled The Mystic, written when Tennyson could not have been more than 17, and to be found, I think, in one edition of the poems by two brothers. It begins, "Angels have talked with him and shown him thrones. Ye knew him not, he was not one of ye. Ye scorned him with an undiscerning scorn. Ye could not read the marvel in his eye. The still serene abstraction he hath felt." Skipping a great deal to the same general effect, we come to the final lines, which are as follows. "How could ye know him? Ye were yet within the narrower circle, he had well nigh reached the last which with a region of white flame, pure without heat into a larger air, upburning and an ether of black blue, investeth and engirds all other lives." As far as the form of this poem is concerned we need not trace any of the lines, though some of them are dignified and worthy of the subject, to anything in the nature of verbal inspiration. As the memoir by his son shows us, Tennyson wrote verse when he was only 8 years old, and the memoir gives us some fairly long and harmonious examples of his boyhood's work, never published during his life. Written when he was 14 or 15. Everyone familiar with the principle of reincarnation will readily understand that so great a poet as Tennyson must have been a poet already in former lives, and could not but bring over the capacity for poetic expression, so that inspiration, merely conveying an idea, could rely on the new personality to clothe it in appropriate language. Thus, although the ideas underlying the mystic can hardly be regarded as originating in the mind of a boy of 17, the words conveying them may have been entirely his own. The description of the mystic is not appropriate to any one on the ordinary plane of life to whom that term might apply. Writers on the philosophical system generally called mysticism are mystics in one sense, but may not have any characteristics resembling those described in the poem. Those are the characteristics which, with others, belong to the highly evolved elder brethren of the human race, now generally spoken of as the masters of wisdom. Of whom, since they themselves have communicated more freely than in former times with the ordinary plane of life, we have come to know a good deal. That they inspire many modern writers with ideas for them to work up in the progress of literature, art, and science is now clearly realized by their pupils in occultism. Conventional thinking has hitherto made at once too much and too little of inspiration. It has been conceived as only a very rare occurrence in connection with writings of a sacred character, its frequency being thus very limited, while its source is thought of as altogether divine. It is really of constant occurrence and emanates from all levels of the divine hierarchy. The extent to which writers and artists, those with some lofty purpose in their work, are helped by invisible beings, on a higher plane of life than their own, can hardly be exaggerated. So there is indeed little reason to be surprised at finding a youthful poet of Tennyson's promise under inspiration from a very early period. But the world was not ripe in the year 1826 for the gift of any detailed information concerning the actual constitution of the divine hierarchy, with its varied levels of dignity and power and intricate agencies. In 1892, towards the close of the great poet's life, conditions had changed in a very remarkable degree. And the flashes of inspiration to which Tennyson lent himself then became wonderfully distinct. A few verses to be found in the volume published in that year, and entitled by an evolutionist, are deeply suggestive. We read as follows. The Lord let the house of a brute to the soul of a man. And the man said, Am I your debtor? And the Lord, Not yet, but make it as clean as you can. And then I will let you a better. Occult students will recognize in these few lines a flood of significant allusion. The words alone may have no deep meaning for readers unfamiliar with the great principles hinted at, but for those who know more they are richly significant. They include, to begin with, the fundamental idea that humanity is evolved from humbler animal life. And beyond this they recognize the method of that evolution, the transfer of consciousness from lower to higher vehicles as the consequence of its own craving for the higher. They recognize more than that indeed, a deep and supremely important idea concerning the nature of consciousness. This is one of the latest developments of advanced occult teaching. Consciousness, that supreme mystery that baffles all physiological research, is uniform in its character throughout all manifestations of life. There is only one kind of consciousness, that of human beings and of the animal creation is the same throughout. Its effective value depends on the vehicle in which it is working. In the body of an animal it is subject to extreme limitations. In the body of a man it has greatly expanded capacities. In the vehicles of consciousness belonging to higher planes it finds these capacities again expanded to an extent which ordinary humanity, at the average stage reached in this world at the present time, cannot even grasp in imagination. At every stage of the process the same law works. Any given volume of consciousness within any given vehicle, gradually becoming an individuality, establishes a claim on nature for an improved vehicle, by making the best possible use of the one it has got. Make it as clean as you can, and then I will let you a better. We can understand the law best by concentrating attention on humanity at first. The man at an early stage of his progress cannot ascend to great heights of achievement. He may be fit for little more than the rougher manual work of physical life. But being by that time a man, he has, if only a glimmering, perception of the difference between right and wrong. He follows the guidance of this perception. He makes the vehicle of his consciousness, which is himself, as clean as he can. In his next incarnation he infallibly acquires a better. Thus the verse above quoted, among other ideas, clearly recognizes the principle of reincarnation, which Tennyson evidently accepted without reserve and worked with continually. In the memoir of Alfred, Lord Tennyson by his son we are told that he left a note to section 43 of In Memoriam, which runs as follows. If the immediate life after death be only sleep, and the spirit between this life and the next should be folded like a flower in a night slumber, then the remembrance of the last night remains as the smell and color do in the sleeping flower. And in that case the memory of our love would last as true and would live pure and whole within the spirit of my friend until after it was unfolded at the breaking of the morn when the sleep was over. In writing this Tennyson was evidently concentrating thought on the idea of rebirth and the recovery of the love relations of the previous life. Even if the intervening period were merely a sleep, the true ego would reappear in the awakening life. The more scientific view of reincarnation, of course, while confidently recognizing that idea, realizes the immense importance of the intervening life on higher planes. Sometimes, indeed, if the ego is at a humble stage of its expansion, the intervening period, though restful and happy, is little better than a blissful sleep. In others it affords magnificent opportunities for the cultivation of intellectual or artistic capacity. True, such growth can only take place as a consequence of some effective seed of aspiration or effort sown in the previous physical life, but even minute seeds of that nature are nuclei from which splendid consequences may ensue. Without in any way interfering with the revival of old loves and even minor friendships dating back to the past. The disregard of this important aspect of the subject operates to render the idea of reincarnation unattractive to people who understand it imperfectly. They think of themselves beginning a new life all alone, as it were. This is a ridiculous misapprehension of the natural law. A moment's thought should show that probability points to the idea that generations living about the same time will, on the average, get through their intervening lives on higher planes, and be ready for reincarnation at about the same time later on. Where personal ties of love or even less powerful affinities associate egos together, their return together becomes a matter of certainty. Adequately trained clairvoyance is equal to the task of verifying that principle, and tracing back, even through ages in the past, the former lives of living people. Whenever genuine mutual affection unites people on this plane of life, they are always found to have been in affectionate relationship in former lives also. There may have been considerate differences in intellectual growth even, but the love tie is supreme, and the ingenuity of the natural law, or of those who guide the natural law to the emergency in such cases. And to much more complicated problems of karma, the convenient term which embraces, among other meanings, the necessity that moral causes engendered in one life shall reap their appropriate consequences in lives of later date. Now let us turn to the last verse of the brief poem, of which the first has been quoted above. I have climbed to the snows of age, and I gaze at a field in the past, where I sank with the body at times in the sloughs of a low desire. But I hear no yelp of the boast, and the man is quiet at last, as he stands on the heights of his life with a glimpse of a height that is higher. The last few words of the last line, a glimpse of a height that is higher, hint unmistakably at the sublime possibilities of initiation. There is no finality in the vast process of human evolution, but there are recognizable stages. The perfect man has reached one of these stages, from which he looks forward to spiritual attainment transcending any condition that can be limited by the term humanity. I need not attempt to elaborate that idea. But we shall see reason to believe that the poet knew more of the height that is higher than he found it possible to put into words. The law under which divine consciousness in humanity seeks and secures better and better vehicles operates also throughout the lower kingdoms. It is not easily traced through animal and vegetable manifestations, but even faintly understood it illuminates the whole doctrine of evolution. Occult students at one time were inclined to find fault with the Darwinian presentation of the idea, as ignoring the evolution of consciousness going on concurrently with the evolution of form. We see now that the evolution of form defines the evolution of consciousness. Consciousness is very far from being a mere attribute of the form, as some materialistic scientists of the last century imagined, but the expression of its infinite capacities depends on the form in which it is working. This view of the subject is worthy of protracted treatment, but there are other poems that claim examination. A little fragment, merely 2 verses, entitled The Making of Man, is well worth attention, but does not do more than reiterate some of the ideas in the verses last discussed. It recognizes the nature of the tiger and the ape as necessarily manifesting in humanity at first, but prophet eyes may catch a glan, slowly gaining on the shade, till the peoples all are one and all their voices blend in Chorik. Hallelujah to the Maker, it is finished. Man is made. We may now turn to the poem which is the fullest expression of occult inspiration among all that suggest that origin, the ancient sage. This, indeed, includes evidence showing that Tennyson in his own consciousness had attained to definite knowledge relating to spiritual conditions far transcending those familiar to the average humanity of our period. The Ancient Sage was published the volume entitled Tiresias and Other Poems. Just preceding the latest of all, Demeter and Other Poems. The sage, obviously a master of wisdom, criticizes a scroll by a young companion who has embodied skeptical, almost materialistic, views in very graceful verse. The scroll recognizes that the earth is fair in hue. But man today is fancy's fool as man hath ever been. The nameless power, or powers, that rule were never heard or seen. The master comments on this. If thou wouldst hear the nameless, and wilt dive into the temple cave of thine own self. There, brooding by the central altar, thou mayst haply learn the nameless hath a voice, by which thou wilt abide, if thou be wise. The scroll still quarrels with the mystery. And since, from when this earth began, the nameless never came among us, never spake with man, and never named the name. And the sage answers with almost the best passage in the whole poem. Thou canst not prove the nameless, O my son. Nor canst thou prove the world thou movest in. Thou canst not prove that thou art body alone. Nor canst thou prove that thou art spirit alone. Nor canst thou prove that thou art both in one. Thou canst not prove thou art immortal, no. Nor yet that thou art mortal, nay my son. Thou canst not prove that I, who speak with thee, am not thyself in converse with thyself. For nothing worthy proving can be proven, nor yet disproven. Wherefore thou be wise. Cleave ever to the sunnier side of doubt, and cling to faith beyond the forms of faith. After a passage in the scroll relating to the darkness and miseries of life, the sage replies, who knows but that the darkness is in man? The doors of night may be the gates of light. For wert thou born or blind or deaf, and then suddenly healed, how wouldst thou glory in all the splendors and the voices of the world? And this leads up to the most striking passage in the poem, in which the sage, in this case Tennyson himself, got out of the body, to use a phrase familiar to occult students, by adopting a method with which they are quite familiar. This consists of self-induced hypnotism brought on by repeating, alone and aloud, one's own name. The repetitions may have to be very numerous, running perhaps into hundreds, and even then the effort may be futile unless the person making it has some psychic potentialities in his nature. But granting that last condition, it is an effective process, and one which Tennyson seems to have been almost in the habit of using. His reference to it in the poem before us is as follows. For more than once when I sat all alone, revolving in myself, the word that is the symbol of myself, the mortal limit of the self was loosed, and passed into the nameless. As a cloud melts into heaven, I touched my limbs, the limbs were strange not mine, and yet no shade of doubt, but utter clearness, and tyro loss of self. The gain of such large life as matched with ours, were sun to spark, unshadowable in words, themselves but shadows of a shadow world. I cannot identify any other allusion in the whole range of Tennyson's poetry that directly relates to experiences of this nature. But in the memoir his son tells us that, in some phases of thought and feeling his idealism tended more decidedly to mysticism. He wrote, a kind of waking trance I have frequently had quite up from boyhood when I have been all alone. This has generally come upon me through repeating my own name 2 or 3 times to myself silently, till all at once, as it were out of the intensity of the consciousness of individuality, the individuality itself seemed to dissolve and fade away into boundless being, and this not a confused state but the clearest of the clearest, the surest of the surest, the weirdest of the weirdest, utterly beyond words. Where death was an almost laughable impossibility, the loss of personality, if so it were, seeming no extinction but the only true life. This might be said to be the state which St. Paul describes, whether in the body I cannot tell, or whether out of the body I cannot tell. He continued, I am ashamed of my feeble description. Have I not said the state is utterly beyond words? But in a moment when I come back to my normal state of sanity, I am ready to fight for mein Leipzig and hold that it will last for eons of eons. In the same way he said that there might a more intimate communion than we could dream of between the living and the dead, at all events for a time. So the spiritualists may fairly claim Tennysonian sanction for the fundamental principle of their belief, which indeed is quite in harmony with the views of advanced occult students. Though some of early date were misled into a needlessly hostile mistrust of the system, apt in some cases to be itself rather misleading. But which, as broadly designed to assure a world drifting at one time into materialism that there is another life after this, and so on, was a generous gift to civilization from levels of higher wisdom. Readers of the memoir will derive, from a very unexpected source, confirmation of the fact that Tennyson made frequent use of the repeated name method of attaining spiritual illumination. It appears that the author asked Professor Tyndall to make some contribution to the work in hand. In the course of a long answer he says, I looked up the account of my first visit to Farringford, and there to my profound astonishment I found described that experience of your fathers which, in the mouth of the ancient sage, was made the ground of an important argument against materialism and in favor of personal immortality 28 years afterwards. If you turn to your father's account of the wonderful state of consciousness superinduced by thinking of his own name and compare it with the argument of the ancient sage, you will see that they refer to one and the same phenomenon. The injunctions which the sage ultimately gives to his pupil, described in the beginning as one that loved, and honored him, and yet was no disciple, richly garbed, but worn from wasteful living, sweep over the whole range of occult ethics. I pick out a few lines from a passage too long to quote in extenso. Let be thy wale and help thy fellow men, and make thy gold thy vassal not thy king, and send the day into the darkened heart, nor list for guerdon in the voice of men, nor roll thy viands on a luscious tongue, nor drown thyself with flies in honeyed wine, nor thou be rageful, like a handled bee, and lose thy life by usage of thy sting, nor harm an adder through the lust for harm, nor make a snail's horn shrink for wantonness. And more, think well. Do well will follow thought. Each injunction will be familiar to readers of theosophical books, and a fortiori to all students of the higher occultism, and that last phrase, do well will follow thought, is an almost amusing reflection of a more elaborate doctrine set forth in certain manuals that profess to guide candidates for initiation in the higher mysteries. They are told first to purify thought, and secondly to purify conduct. From the commonplace point of view that seems putting the cart before the horse, but action may sometimes be thoughtless, and then if it were avoided for no definite reason it would probably be repeated for no definite reason. If purified thought preceded its avoidance, the cure would be permanent. It is needless to carry on further the search for occult allusions in Tennyson's poetry. Fainter hints, in the order of those already quoted, might be pointed out in poems less definitely infused with occult inspiration than the ancient sage, but the broad conclusion to be derived from them all is sufficiently well established. The deeper mysteries of life and nature were still veiled from general knowledge during the greater part of Tennyson's splendid literary activity. It was not his task to tear down the veil completely. Nor did the rifts he made in it here and there afford his readers anything resembling that scientific comprehension of great natural truths lying behind it which many of us have ultimately reached. This attainment inaugurates a new era of thought. But Tennyson intuitively forecast the revelation impending. And perhaps for the cultured classes of this period, slow hitherto to appreciate the significance of the higher occultism, the fact that its development was so clearly foreshadowed in the writings of a man so universally reverenced as Tennyson, may guide modern sympathies into regions of thought which they might never have explored but for that august leadership. Creeds more or less credible. Since the amusing period when Bishop Colenso discovered that the hare does not chew the cud, as the author of the Pentateuch had supposed, the allegory, on the banks of the Nile and elsewhere, has been busy chewing the primitive faith of good people previously content to accept statements in the Bible as necessarily true, even when somewhat surprising. Tempers were often lost during the discussions of the Colenso and Darwin days, but allegory has proved a more good-humored beast than he was thought to be at first. So that critics and the Church can give and take now with a superficial pretense of being friends in reality. Beyond this, indeed, the attitudes of mind on both sides are undergoing change. The ribald scoffer is extinct. The DD who still attributes the sufferings of the world to Eve's conversation with the serpent hides quietly in cathedral towns. Science and theology are on the terms that Talleyrand described as established between himself and the host, when he raised his hat to a Roman Catholic procession, nous saluons mais nous ne parlons pas. And happily these relations are still improving. Science, of the old materialistic order, has had to endure many shocks of late. A police magistrate some years ago refused to believe overwhelming testimony in favor of a spiritualist medium on the ground that it was contrary to the known laws of nature. The members of the Royal Society are no longer so sure of having completely catalogued those laws. And the doubt makes them even respectful to the theory of miracles. After all, turning water into wine is child's play compared with the miracle accomplished whenever artificial incubation turns an egg into a chicken. People who still disbelieve in the phenomena of genuine spiritualism, as puzzling as any records in Christian story, must guard their ignorance very carefully if they wish to preserve their opinions. Science in all directions is negotiating with the unseen, and the wise churchman realizes that some concessions on his part may lead to a settled peace. Promising protection for institutions and substantial interests, he sometimes felt to be in danger from the battering ram. Already there is an entente more or less cordial between the enlightened free-thinker, shedding the folly of denying whatever he does not understand, and the churchman who knows that he must adapt his faith to the uniformities of nature. That it is often unsafe to insist that sacred writings always mean what they seem to say. But questions have arisen that are more embarrassing than the reconciliation of Scripture with obvious physical facts. And these challenge statements that cannot take sanctuary in any theory of divine inspiration. The language of the creeds must at all events be ascribed to human authorship. This is complicated and to some extent obscure, but in criticizing the creeds we are not in trouble with any theory of verbal inspiration from divine levels. The Revised Version of the Bible, humbly attempting to correct a few gross errors of translation, has, according to a familiar anecdote, been treated with faint praise by a sturdy exponent of the early faith who preferred God's own words. But the words adopted to define Christian belief at Nicaea in AD 325 were simply those of certain bishops, who prevailed over other bishops desirous of using different words, so we cannot well bring inspiration into the story. Again, the Nicene Creed was preceded by an extensive creed literature, to use the phrase of an Orthodox writer, though it would be scarcely possible now to identify any writing as the first attempt to put Christian belief on paper. Nor does the importance of the subject at the present time turn upon its historical aspect. The question arising is this: do the creeds, as they are put into the mouths of people who attend church at the present day, express beliefs they can possibly be expected to entertain? The question may fairly be described as having arisen, because it has been recently the subject of correspondence in the Times. Canon Glazebrook in a book called The Faith Zero A Modern Churchman says that the clauses in the Apostles' Creed, born of the Virgin Mary, and the third day he rose again from the dead, can legitimately be interpreted symbolically. The Bishop of Ely, in a letter addressed to Canon Glazebrook and also published in the Times, refuses to accept this view. And supports his refusal by quoting a resolution adopted by the bishops of the whole Anglican Communion assembled at the Lambeth Conference in 1908. Which runs as follows: the conference, in view of tendencies widely shown in writings of the present day, hereby places on record its conviction that the historical facts stated in the creeds are an essential part of the faith of the Church. Canon Glazebrook, in a long letter published in the Times of May 21, does not argue the question on its merits but quotes episcopal sayings that deprecate undue limitations on freedom of thought and inquiry. And attributes to the Bishop of Oxford a view of the Ascension which he summarizes in this way: Our Lord could not, for astronomical reasons of which the disciples were ignorant, physically ascend into heaven. But in order to give to them a right conception of his change of state he rose to a moderate height in the air, and then so veiled himself behind a cloud that they believed him to have gone right up into the vault of the sky. If the bishop is fairly represented by this summary, the suggestion needs expansion. What was the later course of events? When our Lord, having deluded his disciples in the manner described, wanted to come down again, how did he conceal his reappearance? But while the bishop's hypothesis tempts further comment, this might seem wanting in due reverence for the main idea concerned, so no more on that subject need be said for the moment. And yet that line of speculation in reference to alleged occurrences that outrage common sense, is one into which it is easy to be driven if people are content to think of nature as simply consisting of that which appeals to the five senses. Even though the whole may be vaguely regarded as bathed in spiritual conditions intangible as thought, out of relation with space or time, offering nothing to the imagination that can prefigure a future existence. Except of a kind to be spoken of with bated breath and avoided as long as possible. Only for those, happily a large and increasing number, who comprehend more or less completely the intervening conditions of nature lying between the dense manifestation of the physical plane and the incomprehensible, though not less real, conditions of exalted planes. Only by virtue of their superior enlightenment is it possible to get rid, first of the dread commonly connected with the process of passing on, and secondly of the embarrassment arising from occasional occurrences which without such enlightenment must either be disbelieved in defiance of evidence or dealt with by some grotesquely foolish explanation. That idea applies very forcibly to the study of the creeds. The writers who reduced them to their present shape may have been using physical plain language in a metaphorical sense, or they may simply have swallowed without hesitation statements absurd on their face. But in either case we have to recognize, in the light of modern occult knowledge, that somewhere in the back history of the creed such knowledge must have been in the possession of some person or persons who inspired the earliest writers on the subject. And we reach, with the same confidence, the conclusion that current versions of the creeds have been the product of painfully clumsy editing. Such work could only have been carried out properly by editors saturated with knowledge of natural conditions unseen by the multitude, while the actual editors were certainly not of that type. As a mere first illustration of that idea we may take the few words in the Apostles' Creed about the resurrection and the ascension: the third day he rose again from the dead. He ascended into heaven and sitteth on the right hand of God the Father, etc. For people who can only think of a being still in touch with the earth as of human flesh and bones, the statement must either be rejected altogether as fabulous, or must lead to conceptions which, followed out in detail, are deplorably degrading. But directly we begin to understand how human personalities may function in full consciousness, after escaping, for a time or for good, from imprisonment in the physical body, functioning in another available vehicle, the astral body, we see light shed on alleged phenomena otherwise inexplicable. Many of us know now that natural law ever provides for the temporary materialization of the astral form so that it may become apparent to physical senses. The story of the ascension thus comes within the range of comprehensible occurrences, even if we make no attempt to interpret it by more profound thinking another way altogether. Perhaps to understand its origin properly we must pay attention first to the ritual adopted in ancient Egypt in connection with initiation in the mysteries, ages before the Christian era. The candidate lay down on a great wooden cross hollowed out so as to support the figure. Was bound on it, quite loosely so as to suggest the voluntary character of the sacrifice, and then was put, mesmerically, into a deep trance which involved the emergence from the body of his real consciousness in the astral form. The body was then deposited in a sarcophagus, to typify burial. In the astral body the real entity was confronted with varied experiences educating him in the idea that he, the real entity, was beyond the reach of injury from fire, water, or even the subtler perils of the underworld. Then, on the third day the physical body was brought up into the light of the sunrise, and its resurrection, the return to it of the real ego, was accomplished. Followed out more closely, the Egyptian ceremony included other superphysical suggestions that may have been in the mind of those who sketched the earliest draft of the creed. Before being awakened the candidate had touch, out of the body, with sublime levels of consciousness, as definitely an ascent into heaven as the underworld experiences were a descent into hell. The underworld in question is, of course, only a part, a low subdivision, of the enormous astral world that surrounds the physical globe, and is growing familiar in these days to many explorers. Its loftier realms are widely expanded regions that provide for happy conditions of life, and for happy conditions as varied as there are variations, amongst people still in life of aspirations pointing to happiness. How did it come to pass that allusions to the ritual of the Egyptian mysteries found their way into the Christian creed? To frame a conjecture we must begin by realizing that the Egyptian ceremonial was itself an allegory based on fundamental ideas connected with the science of human evolution, fully understood by those who invented the ritual. We can see this hinting at the ordeal of suffering incidental to the physical life, at the possibility of further suffering in the underworld as the penalty of evil doing here, at the restful touch with happier conditions, the ascent into heaven. At the return to earth life after this, the resurrection or more literally the reincarnation of the ego. Whoever infused into that early, creed literature, the first suggestion for a formula of belief must have had the Egyptian allegory in his mind, together with a perfect comprehension of its deep meaning, as also embodied in the Christian story. For many reasons besides those that have to do with the illumination of the creeds, it is deplorable that the clergy at large do not avail themselves of growing knowledge concerning the unseen worlds, which might enable them in turn to become more or less competent spiritual teachers. Some few are emerging from the stagnant majority, but for the rest to pose as experts in dealing with the interests of humanity lying outside those of the current life, while remaining ignorant of all that is now becoming known concerning the life hereafter, is like claiming to practice as a doctor without knowing more about the human body that was known to the barber surgeons of the Middle Ages. Even the humblest spiritualist has realized that life hereafter is accessible to investigation. He may investigate very clumsily, his grasp even of the main idea may be very incomplete, but he knows that he is in touch with another plane of existence. That death, for all decent people, is an introduction to life of a more promising kind than that which the physical plane provides for as a rule. The average clergyman, meanwhile, will not avail himself of the means by which he, with a more cultivated mind, might not only realize this much, but expand his comprehension of the ultimate spiritual possibilities awaiting humanity to an enormous extent. If it were not so profoundly distressing, there would be something supremely ludicrous in the spectacle of a vast organization, whose raison d'etre is the general human thirst for guidance in spiritual thought, resolutely keeping aloof from avenues of research proved by abundant experience to be richly stored with spiritual wisdom for all who explore them. This view of the matter will become more and more impressive when attention is turned to those passages in the creeds which relate to the virgin birth. For those who only can think in terms of physical plane matter, the virgin birth seems to strain imagination less than an ascent to heaven by a tangible flesh and blood Christ. Birth of any sort is a mystery. A virgin birth would be only a little more mysterious than one of the ordinary kind. But the first thought that suggests a pause for reflection arises from the undeniable fact that other religions before Christianity claimed virgin births for their founders. Is this merely due to a pious desire in each case to dignify the origin of the founder, or can it bear a more intricate explanation? This is certainly the case in reference to the adaptation of the familiar doctrine to the Christian story. To get at the actual truth hinted at metaphorically by the virgin birth idea, we must go rather deeply into modern developments of superphysical science. By its help we are enabled to recognize the creative achievement, when a solar system comes into existence, as involving successive processes, first the formation of molecular matter from the atomic raw material pervading all space. We need not talk about the origin of that, any more than about the beginning of eternity. But a solar system has a beginning and a destiny. It is an episode in eternity, and the creation of a world is an episode within the enormously protracted life of a solar system. Molecular matter constituting in its various aspects the chemical elements, as they used to be called, becomes available for the formation of a globe destined to be a living planet. We see the process still going on in the growth of nebulae with which the heavens abound. At a later stage divine power pours out from itself the life principle. The vegetable and animal kingdoms come into existence. Later, again, when the human stage is reached, a further emanation from divinity invests definite beings with what is sometimes called the divine spark, with that which renders such beings immortal, capable of developing through successive earth lives the loftier attributes of intellect and spirituality. The three stages are described by many phrases, sometimes as three waves of atmic influence, sometimes as the first, second, and third logos, sometimes as the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Now when we attempt to see how this view of creation affects the language of the Apostles and Nicene creeds, we have to keep touch with another line of thought. The history of the creeds points to a definite human origin, but the hints their language embodies point, as already suggested, to inspiration from a lofty source of wisdom. While it also betrays the corruption of such hints as successive versions have been prepared. Lofty wisdom has always lain hidden in the hands of the elder brethren of the race, who well knew that primitive conditions of civilization would not allow of its general diffusion. The general diffusion, however, of large extracts from it is now in progress, taking shape in the higher occultism of recent years. Thus we can now discern in much ancient writing of a religious character the streak of inspiration and the superposed blundering of unenlightened transmitters of the inspiration. The passage in the Apostles' Creed about the virgin birth is a thrilling example of both influences. The adjective, virgin, has been applied in very ancient literature to mo iter, as due to the action of the first logos, or the first creative wave. Only when, after intervening development, it is touched with the third logos, or Holy Ghost, can it engender the Christ principle. That idea gels twisted, by primitive ignorance capable only of thought along the lines of the physical senses, into the idea of a conception by a woman free of the conditions that generally give rise to conception. And then in the Nicene Creed we get the gross misunderstanding developed into the unfortunate expression, the only begotten Son of God. How does this subtle interpretation of the familiar language fit in with the gospel story which the creeds seem to follow? The literal accuracy of that story has been challenged by critics who object to miracles, and nothing that can be called contemporary authentic history affords it any sanction. But from the occult point of view, that is to say, from the point of view of knowledge that relies on something much more trustworthy than written history, the story is contemplated in a deeply reverential spirit, but is not treated throughout as a mere record of occurrences. The occultist has resources at his disposal when investigating the past that leave mere literary research panting in the rear. The principle is intelligible to all who appreciate the significance of clairvoyance, in some of its suggestive developments. One kind enables the clairvoyant to take cognizance of events going on at the time in some distant place. Another kind deals with events distant in past time. There is a memory of nature in which some clairvoyants can share, and that is faultless in its exactitude. Clairvoyants who can do this while living the ordinary life among us are few, but now that the veil between ourselves and the masters of wisdom, our elder brethren, the great adepts, has been lowered to an appreciable extent. Many others besides clairvoyants are in touch with teachers for whom perfect clairvoyance in time is as much a natural faculty as common physical sight with us. Thus we need not be all dependent, when desirous of knowing what really happened in Palestine when Christianity was inaugurated, on Alexandrian writers who endeavored to frame the record some centuries later. The memory of nature may discredit the literal accuracy of that record without impairing in the faintest degree the reverential feeling with which we contemplate the inauguration. The sublimity of the Christ incarnation is all the better understood when we get rid of the idea that Jesus when a baby was already the Christ. No great spiritual being, taking a new physical plane birth for any reason or definite purpose, ever takes charge of the new body from infancy. That is done by one of his disciples. At maturity the disciple quits the body and the master ego occupies it. Most people at the present day are so densely ignorant of their own constitution that they may regard the idea as bewildering. At a certain level of knowledge, the body is no more than a vesture to be put on or off as occasion may require. In the case of the Christ incarnation, the ego who took charge of the body in the first instance was indeed of no ordinary type. And through later births Jesus, if we cling to the use of the old name, has ascended to great altitudes in the divine hierarchy. But the Christ, who made use of the body he surrendered in Palestine, descended for that purpose from a loftier altitude still. The bundle of miscellaneous statements at the end of the Apostles' Creed, and also embedded in the Nicene Creed, need not claim much attention except so far as the resurrection of the body has been a stumbling block for all who realize the gross absurdity of the phrase in its plain meaning, and may not understand that the astral body that which resurges. But if we pass on to a consideration of the third great creed with which Orthodox Christianity is entangled, we have to deal with a blend of wisdom and folly that is very well worth the closest attention. In its naked brutality, the Athanasian Creed drives many people out of churches in which it is read aloud. Some clergymen will not consent to read it at all. Others, whose orthodoxy is equal to the digestion of any horrors clothed in theological tradition, are able to do so. Meanwhile, those in a position to reconstruct the teaching ludicrously caricatured by the language of the Athanasian Creed may easily divest it of its blasphemous absurdities and show it to have been originally inspired by profound wisdom and knowledge. Summarized as it stands, it consists of a series of assertions that contradict one another, together with a broad assurance that all who fail to believe them both ways will be damned. Perish everlastingly, is the expression used at first, but a reference later on to everlasting fire invests it with more specific meaning. To avoid this fate we have to believe a string of assertions frankly described as incomprehensible. Strange to say, it is easy for anyone who has profited by the light thrown in recent years on the course of human evolution to discern, behind the gibberish of the Athanasian Creed as it stands, the profoundly scientific ideas that some exalted teacher of the past must have tried to suggest to some insufficiently receptive mind engaged in the effort to express them. For there is a period in the history of every great human race, ours is only one of many, when the state of each person's belief, or capacity to understand deep spiritual truth, has an important bearing on his subsequent progress. The solar system includes other human